Board members, I'd like to call this meeting to order. Good morning. My name is Jim Hart, and I'm the Chair of the Toronto Police Services Board. I'd like to welcome you all to this hybrid meeting of the Board. I will now read the Indigenous Land Acknowledgement. Although this meeting is taking place virtually, we acknowledge that the land we're on as we hold this meeting is the traditional territory of many nations, including the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat peoples, and is now home to many diverse First Nations, Inuit, and Métis people. The Board also acknowledges that Toronto is covered by Treaty 13 with the Mississaugas of the Credit and the Williams Treaties, signed with multiple Mississauga and Chippewa bands. Board members, are there any declarations of interest on the Municipal Conflict of Interest Act? Seeing none, let me move forward. I'll now turn the meeting over to our Executive Director and Chief of Staff, Mr. Ryan Teschner, who will go over the meeting logistics. Mr. Teschner.
Thank you, Chair Hart, and thank you to everyone who's joined us in person, as well as those who have called in to this meeting. Please note that, as always, this meeting is being live streamed on the Toronto Police Service YouTube account and will be available there at the conclusion of this meeting. Joining us today, we have Chair Jim Hart, Mayor John Tory, Vice Chair Francis Nunziata, Member Ainsworth Morgan, Member Ann Morgan, and Councillor Mark Rhymes. Member Lisa Kostakis will be joining us shortly. We also have members of our board office staff, Chief Raymer, his command team, members of the service, and of course, members of the public. We have individuals who have registered to make deputations, both in person as well as virtually, on some of our agenda items. As with our regular meeting process, deputations will be heard prior to the item being discussed on and considered by board members. When it comes time to do a deputation, those who have registered will be called upon or brought into the meeting by our colleague, Du Buchanan-Gisser, and as always, deputants will speak, followed by an opportunity for board members to ask them questions. Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Teschner. I'll now go through the agenda for holds and approvals. Item number 1 is the confirmation of the minutes from the meeting held on September the 13th, 2022. Can I have a motion to approve the minutes? Councillor Grimes, could I have a seconder? Ms. Morgan, all in favor? Any opposed? That carries. Item number 2 is the 2021 Toronto Police College Training Program. We have a presentation and we have some deputations on item number 2, so that's held down. Item number 3 is the Auditor General Draft Project Implementation Strategy, also a presentation, also a deputation, so 3 is held down. Item number 4 is a request for amendment to the use of special event funding, LGBT Purge 30th anniversary. Could I have a motion to approve item number 4? Councillor Grimes, seconder. Mayor Tory, all in favor. Any opposed? Item 4 carries. I want to thank Nicole Corrado for her written submission on item number 4.
Excuse me, Chair, just on that, I noticed the one thing that was missing in the report was a date of the event. If somebody had that, it just wasn't in the report. It just said it was happening and we were funding it, which I was thrilled to.
We'll get that.
Good, yeah, thank you.
Get that. Item number 5 is the final report, inquest into the death of Mr. Alexander Wetlaufer, jury verdict and recommendations. I believe we have a couple of motions on that. Is that correct, Mr. Teschner?
Yes, Mr. Chair, for item 5, we do have a motion.
So I'll hold that down for the motions. Item number 6 is a response to the jury recommendations from the coroner's inquest into the death of Mr. Quinn McDougall. Item number 6, can I have a motion to approve? Board members, Ms. Morgan, a seconder, Vice Chair Nunziata, all in favor. Any opposed? That carries. And I thank Nicole Corrado for her written submission on item 6. Item number 7 is a request for review of a service complaint investigation, professional standards case number PRS 085961. Motion to approve item number 7. Motion to approve. Mr. Morgan, seconder. Vice Chair Nunziata, all in favor. Any opposed? Item number 7 carries. Item number 8 is the annual report 2022 filing of Toronto Police Service procedures. We have some deputations on item number 8, so that's held down. Our last item is item number 9, Chief Administrative Investigation Reports, 9.1, 9.2, and 9.3. Motion to approve, or receive rather. Ms. Morgan, Vice Chair Nunziata, all in favor. Any opposed? 9 carries. We'll now go back up to the beginning of the agenda to item number 2. Actually, before we go to item number 2, Chief, I believe you want to do your monthly verbal update at this point in time?
Yes, good morning, Chair, members of the board. I just wanted to provide a very brief update on vehicle thefts in Toronto and the formation of the recently introduced Organized Crime Investigative Support Team. I wanted to just inform the public on the progress that we were making to date, given the introduction of this team just, as you recall, back in June. This issue came to prominence toward the end of last year when it was widely reported that vehicle thefts had spiked in our city. The fact that it is being reported on extensively in the media and continues to be as recently as last week, and that it was the subject of a City of Toronto Council motion, speaks to the extent to which this has become a concern for our residents, our elected officials, and for us as a service. In 2021, we had over 4,000 reported vehicle thefts. Already in 2022, we've had over 6,000. These numbers are no doubt alarming. I can report that similar spikes have been experienced in other Canadian cities. I recognize why this is a significant concern for our residents. Vehicle theft is more than just a property crime. It's about more than just the inconvenience of losing a vehicle and its contents. Having individuals enter onto your property, often in the middle of the night, and remove your vehicle from your driveway or garage leaves families feeling violated and neighborhoods feeling unsafe. For residents who have had this occur more than once, which we know has been happening, it's unnerving and beyond frustrating. As a service, we recognize that we had to restore a service-wide investigative team. Formerly the Major Crime Task Force, we now have deployed OCIS, again, the Organized Crime Investigative Support Team. Addressing vehicle thefts at the divisional level, in other words, assigning the investigation to local investigators in a particular division, had limited success, not because of effort, but simply due to the nature and extent of the problem and the capacity of individual divisions. When a suspect was identified and arrested, it generally meant that a single investigation was solved, a single vehicle theft, and a single suspect prosecuted. What it didn't address was the fact that crime groups are now behind the majority of vehicle thefts and are operating throughout the GTA. Arresting one individual left little or no deterrent for the broader crime group that was behind the operation. Redeploying resources from other areas of the service, the new team is now a dedicated sub-unit within our organized crime enforcement pillar. As a centralized unit, OSIS is mandated to conduct theft vehicle investigations, among other types of investigations, across the city and beyond, to identify trends and to use investigative techniques intended to disrupt organized crime groups. To this end, and despite still being a relatively new unit, OSIS is now actively involved in a number of investigations targeting organized vehicle thieves. While I cannot at this stage disclose the details of these ongoing investigations, what I can tell the public is that much of the work being done by OSIS is focusing on groups that are stealing vehicles in Toronto and the GTA and exporting them for profit overseas. In addition to disruption and enforcement, the team is working with domestic and international partners to locate and repatriate vehicles that were sent overseas in shipping containers. I'm pleased to report that OSIS has already contributed to the seizure of dozens of vehicles stolen from our streets, representing several $1 million in recovered assets. I can further advise that due to the nature of organized crime in general, we're seeing overlap in OSIS investigations with those of the Gun and Gang Task Force and the Hold Up Squad, which is responsible for our carjacking investigations and similar investigations by other police agencies. It's becoming clear that the work of OSIS is helping to advance investigations even beyond the scope of its mandated work. We are updating the community to ensure they understand that we have taken their concerns on this issue seriously. We are responding, and I'm confident that we're making progress, though we have much more work to do. I'm optimistic that with time, OSIS early success will translate to long-term improvement on this significant issue of public concern. We'll continue to provide the public with updates through the media when we are in a position to do so, as well as through future updates to the board. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Chief. Questions to the Chief? Mayor Tory.
Chief, thank you for that update. I wonder if you could just update the public, and I know you've done it before and your colleagues have, just with respect to the resources, because I believe I'm correct in saying that, and you might just talk about what the unit consists of that's been reestablished, as well as I think some deployment of uniformed and other resources in communities where there's been a prevalence of this, just because I think that the public would be interested to know that you've responded in that kind of targeted way, as well as to have these other resources put in place you made reference to.
Yes, thank you, Mayor Tory. So, with respect to the unit itself, the unit is 13 individuals that are specifically assigned to the unit. But in addition to that, because of the ongoing problem, We've had officers assigned from various divisions in the city, particularly in the high theft areas, working alongside the hold-up squad in a coordinated fashion to address the carjackings, the increased robberies, quite frankly, we're seeing in jewelry stores as well, and the car thefts. So it is very much in addition to OSIS, it's a much more coordinated effort across the city.
Vice Chair Nunziata.
Yeah, just a question. So I have a lot of them in my ward, but a lot of them now have, residents have security cameras, and they, more so now than they ever have. So the videos from the security cameras are used, are they very effective on arresting some of these individuals?
Yeah, the videos are always helpful and can provide leads. Quite often the individuals are masked, so it may not provide precise identification of an individual, but there's other items that are of interest to us as well when the investigative teams are looking at this. So video is very, very important. And I know a lot of people now are going back to putting the clubs on their vehicles as well.
Yeah.
And yeah, so anything that they can do to help provide a deterrent to these individuals is beneficial and would certainly help our investigation when it comes to dealing with cameras.
Thank you.
Any further questions? Seeing none. Thank you, Chief. Thanks for the update. We'll now move on to item number 2, which is the 2021 Toronto Police College Training Program. We have a presentation. We'll hear from the presenters first, then we'll do deputations, and then we'll have questions of service members. Welcome.
Thank you. Good morning, Chief, Command, Chair Hart, Mayor Corey, members of the board, and members of the public. I'd like to thank you very much for this opportunity to share some information about the training that the Toronto Police Service receives, about the day-to-day operation and the structure of the Toronto Police College, and some of the new initiatives and new types of training that we'll be rolling out shortly. My name is Frank Barreto. I'm the superintendent. I'm the unit commander of the college. And joining me today as well is Staff Sergeant Pat Coyne of the Learning Development and Standards section, and civilian subject matter expert and instructor, Ms. Nasra Abdi. They'll be assisting me in today's presentation. And acknowledging that it has been some time since there's been a presentation of this type, we felt that the most appropriate place to begin would be with a look at the totality of the training. This slide purports to represent the raw and total numbers of all of the training that the Toronto Police Service experienced in 2021. And you might notice the very central number there, 46,134 sessions. That essentially reflects the number of times that a member of the Toronto Police Service successfully completed some type of training, a training session. So what is a training session? It can be a number of different things. For example, a training session could be a member of the Toronto Police who has been at a network computer and participated in some type of e-learning, an online course, and you'll find that this happens a great number of times. In fact, some 26,000 times in 2021 was this kind of training completed by members. As well, a training session may be a member attending at the Toronto Police College in person, in the classic sense of being in a classroom with instructors, with fellow students, and taking a course that could last between one day and several. A training session could also be a member leaving their home unit and attending at a specialty unit. For instance, at the ETF, the Emergency Task Force, they have a 6-week BTOC course, Basic Tactical Orientation course. A member would perform 6 weeks of training at the ETF in order to successfully complete that as well. So those are all training sessions. But of course, it's also easy to perhaps consider where these types of training all exist, where they live, who's responsible for them. And so if you direct your attention to the top of the circle, that, of course, is the Toronto Police College. So there's about 100 people that work at the Toronto Police College. We're just 3 of them. It's about 3/4 police officers, about 1/4 civilians. And in 2021, we were responsible for developing and delivering 72 different types of courses, which resulted in some 13,000 sessions of training completed by service members. Moving clockwise around the diagram, you'll see units other than the Toronto Police College also developing and delivering and being in charge of various types of training. So these are our specialty units. This is the ETF, the Marine Unit, Communication Services, PDS. They develop and deliver various types of training, usually very specialized training to members across the service. Sometimes receiving that training is a prerequisite to even applying to join one of those units, but of course they also maintain the skill levels of their own members of that unit throughout. And there's about 4,800 sessions completed in that year. Continuing around, we have the Canadian Police College and the Ontario Police College. So these police institutions essentially attend to the interests of police services nationwide and across the province, respectively. So certain types of courses are really only available from these institutions. In order, for instance, to make an officer into a bomb technician, a CBRNE technician, they would have to attend at the Canadian Police College for a number of intensive courses in order to achieve a type of federal or national certification. Smaller numbers, of course, but nonetheless important. Moving around again, CSCEC stands for Conferences, Seminars, and Continuing Education Courses. Some types of training simply doesn't fit into the other categories, and it's only available in specific places. So this might involve something like an emergency management symposium, perhaps something specialized like a particular polygraph user course, and certain types of university training. So for instance, within the next few days, we'll be sending some senior officers to the Rotman School of Business for a 3-week course on police leadership. Again, smaller numbers, but nonetheless important. And lastly, I mentioned online training or e-learning. This has been a field of police training that has been growing significantly in the last decade or so. And essentially where we get most of this type of training is from CPKN. That stands for the Canadian Police Knowledge Network. So this is a nationwide organization that essentially exists in partnership with police services across the country. It's a type of partnership because content of these courses is created by CPKN, but also by the police services themselves. Developing content and essentially making it available and making it distributable to all of the services that require it. So they have quite an extensive catalog of courses, and the Toronto Police Service certainly makes use of it. So some 26,000 courses completed and 98 different types of training. So now, what I'd like to do is explain a little bit more about the Toronto Police College itself. The college is subdivided into 7 sections that work in concert with each other for many different types of training, but also have their own core specific responsibilities. And I've only listed a few of the types of responsibilities beneath each subheading. You'll notice that that doesn't add up to 72, but I'll just briefly work our way through the components of the college. And first, left to right, is Learning, Development, and Standards. And that is the section where Pat and Nasser work in, and you'll be hearing more from them shortly. So this section takes responsibility for much of the content that has something to do with EIHR. New and emerging modules, certainly they attend to wellness. They've been very integral in the rollout of body-worn camera training and things of that nature. And they are very much the drivers of day one of ISTP, which is the in-service training program, and I'll be talking about that more in detail shortly. Moving along to the community policing section. This is a large section that, for the most part, attends to the needs of new recruits. This is the section that makes police officers out of new recruits. You could say that there's a real ebb and flow to this kind of work. It's almost as though the tide comes in every so often when we get 100 or so recruits in the building, and activity swells across the college. And I'll be talking about the recruit program as well momentarily. The incident response team used to be called the use of force training section. This is probably the largest section of the college. It has some 40 or so officers divided into 2 teams who work alternate shifts. In essence, there is always the incident response team working because the college is operating, delivering training 7 days a week. They're responsible for lots of different types of training, but certainly their main product is the in-service training program. Moving along to the right, investigative, it's probably exactly as you think it might be. This small but important section attends to the things that are related to investigations, how to prepare search warrants, intimate partner violence courses, sexual assault courses, that kind of training. Not as often running as ISTP, but certainly frequently delivered to our members every year. Armament and PVO, PVO standing for Police Vehicle Operations. Again, more or less exactly the kinds of things you'd think they would be doing. PVO is about helping our members effectively and safely use the various types of police vehicles that the service uses. Armament looks after all of the use of force tools, as well as the administration and purchasing and state of good repair of all of the equipment that the service uses in this regard, and they provide a number of courses as well. Admin support, as you might imagine, there's a lot of business behind the scenes in the running of a college. registration for courses, certain budgeting elements. This unit also this section also attends to a lot of the first aid training, the St. John's Ambulance partnership that we have, and certainly helps keep everything running smoothly. And lastly, the special constable section. So this is essentially a new amalgamation, if you will, a merging of court officers, booking officers, and district special constables into one new entity called special constables, and they are trained by this section. It's the first time we've rolled out this merging of the three disciplines together into one course, and it's actually underway right now. It's a 13-week course to produce special constables who will then be assigned to their duties across the service when they graduate sometime in November. So a frequent question that comes along to us is, how do you evaluate training? How do you know that it is effective? And to assist me in explaining some of the process behind that is Staff Sergeant Pat Coyne. Oh, excuse me. I forgot that there was still a button to push, and I did want to talk about the recruit program and the in-service training program. So the recruit training program, I said I would come to it, and I thought it would be helpful, if only for the sake of the public, to understand what it is, how you would make a new recruit, a new hire, into a police officer. It takes about 6 months, and certainly there's a lot to be said about what's involved in the selection process and the recruiting, getting the best candidates to the service, and that was probably worthy of a presentation of its own. But once they arrive at the college, the job is ours. They are assigned to our staff, and we look after making them into police officers. And I like to describe it myself as a play with 3 acts. There really are 3 sections involved. You'll obviously see pre and post there, but the way I like to describe it to people is to say that on day 1, on Act 1, onboarding begins to occur. This is familiarization with the uniform, with the equipment that they're going to be using, certainly preparing them for essentially the on-ramp to the highway that they're going to be getting on insofar as training goes. They spend about 2 weeks with us at the college, and we go through this process of getting them ready. You might say that it's at this point that the culture of policing starts to seep into their identities. Certainly the culture of the Toronto Police Service begins to take hold, and the learning process begins here. Act 2, when the curtain rises, they find themselves living and working in Elmer, Ontario, at the Ontario Police College. This is the site of a former Air Force base, and it's a police facility designed essentially for the needs of all police services in Ontario. So the 100 or 120 recruits that we send to Elmer find themselves now part of a larger group of about 400 to 500 recruits from across the province. These are called cadets in training, and they'll intermingle with each other. They'll get to know police officers or future police officers from across the province, and they'll be mixed up into different groups. And this is called the Basic Constable Training Program, the BCT. And as far as provincial requirements are considered, this is the basic core requirement to be a police officer in Ontario. This takes 3 months. And when this phase, this act concludes, it's at a ceremony to celebrate their successful completion. There's some dignitaries from the province, certainly from different police agencies, and they graduate from this phase of their training. But there is an Act 3, and this resumes again at the Toronto Police College, where we will have them again for about 2.5 more months. And it's at this point that we will hone the skills. We will certainly remediate any deficiencies that anyone is lagging behind. We will layer in a lot more training, particularly as it relates to de-escalation, as it relates to simulations, as it relates to Toronto-specific procedures, bylaws, certainly getting a better understanding of the different communities within our city, certainly getting presentations from many representatives of different units from Toronto. We hone their skills with use of force, with de-escalation, with understanding mental health and some of the resources that exist in the city. And of course, they graduate at a ceremony that we hold within the Toronto Police College. And it's from that point on that they are police officers. They receive their badges for the first time, and then they are sent off to do police work wherever the city needs them the most. So, the in-service training program. This is also what you could say one of our flagship products. If we were going to train only 2 courses, it would be the recruit training and the in-service training program. This has been called APT, or block training. It's something that is quite consistent across police services in North America. It's an annual refresher. And where you could source our approach to this is with the provincial government again, because of course The adequacy standards of the government require that any police officer in Ontario who may be required to use force must requalify in the use of that force every 12 months. To only attend to the bare minimum requirements, because they do stipulate exactly how many hours must be spent on shooting, on baton work, on judgment training, it would take us about 8 hours or 10 hours to get every officer in Toronto requalified. And this is for sergeants, excuse me. This training is directed at constables, sergeants, and staff sergeants. So it would only take us 1 day if we did the bare minimum, but we take 3 days, and many other services in the GTA and around also similarly do something far in excess of the 1 day minimum. And in those 3 days, we start off with a lot of classroom theory and instruction. So that's our day one, which is attended to largely by the Learning Development and Standards section. You'll hear about some of those courses that they get momentarily. And then days 2 and 3 are layered on with additional judgment training, de-escalation training, certainly scenarios, classroom lectures, and it's here that we attempt to evaluate whether the theory and instruction that they received in the classroom is being demonstrated by the officers. Are they demonstrating to us confidence and competence in the things that they have been learning? So this is one of the ways that we continue to evaluate. And so this is my way of interrupting Pat Coyne from getting here and giving you some more detail about evaluation, and I'll turn over the microphone to him now.
Good morning. As mentioned, at the college we utilize the Kirkpatrick model of training evaluation. This is a globally recognized evaluation standard that's used by a number of organizations and a number of industries. It's currently the model used in Canada as well at other police units. Oh, there we go, thank you. Other police units, training units, including the RCMP at Depot, the Canadian Police College, and for some courses at the Ontario Police College. Measuring the effectiveness of training, it can be complex and challenging. We use this model to ensure that we overcome some of these challenges and that we continue to develop training that's effective but also meets the needs of our members. All courses at the college are measured to a minimum of the level 2 of the hierarchy, and some reach the level 3, which I'll highlight shortly. I'll run through them quickly. I know that they were contained in the report on training. Level 1, did our participants find the program positive, worthwhile, relevant to their work? This level of evaluation occurs during the training and at the end, and also evaluates the method used by the facilitators to deliver the training. Level 2, did the participants actually learn what we were intending to teach them? This level of evaluation determines whether there was actually a change in the knowledge, skills, or abilities by the end of training. As mentioned, this is reached for all training as the minimum level at the college. It can be done through exams, in-class evaluations by instructors, and other ways. For example, when members participate in scenario and simulator-based training. For example, on the in-service training course for this year, it's a 3-day program, as was mentioned. On day 2 and 3, members participate in scenario and simulator training where they need to demonstrate skills learned on day 1, and that's evaluated using standardized rubrics. When the members are participating in this training, they're not just being measured on day 1 material, but from material scaffolded from previous years of training. So that blends slowly into our level 3 training, which is level 3 on the hierarchy, behavior or transfer. Did the learning translate into changed behaviors in the workplace? So methods used to conduct this level of evaluation include post-course surveys, interviews in the field, and observations, but it's very dependent on the type of training that was delivered. For example, training to correct errors being made in paperwork of some kind of report or documentation would require a very different level and less complicated process than for evaluation of training related to critical decision-making or implicit bias. The college does engage in survey-based level 3 analysis, which was mentioned in the year-end report. The most recent level 3 occurred for training that was delivered throughout 2021, as it follows a year later. The most recent ones were for 4 courses, the body-worn camera training, the 2021 e-learning module for anti-Black racism, the intimate partner violence investigative course, and the conducted energy weapons course. We're always making improvement to our training and evaluation. Now we're currently developing an improved process for level 3 analysis for in-service training that's being delivered this year. So this analysis will begin in the spring of 2023. There could be challenges with post-course surveys that are sent out 6 months to a year after training is completed. Although this separation in time is necessary to properly evaluate behavioral changes, learner participation and accuracy of some of the responses can suffer. So we've developed a new process, and we're working on it right now, where this level 3 analysis will actually take place in the classroom, embedded in the following year's training. And we anticipate that this will significantly increase the participation, but also the data that we're receiving from our members that we can then use for further development of training and for better reporting. And finally, level 4, did the program have the desired impact? This level is more related to organizational change as opposed to individual learner changes. Depending on the complexity of the training that's delivered, this level traditionally is much more complicated. It's more long-term, and it requires a much greater allocation of resources. In October of last year, in response to multiple recommendations to provide an assessment on the impact of training, the college issued a request for proposal for external third-party proponents to develop a transfer of learning study for the college. Unfortunately, the RFP failed to identify any interested proponents. In response to this, the college is currently engaged in a review of that process, but we're going to continue to utilize the evaluation model that we have, and we're going to take advantage of other opportunities that arise, such as the embedding of level 3 analysis into the classroom. And additionally, we've also onboarded a new research analyst at the college, and that's going to greatly assist us in this area. Thank you, sir.
Thank you, Pat. So how is it that training becomes training? What are the causes that bring about some new development of training or some evolution of existing types of training? And I hesitated to add this slide, because I thought that it might border on what might be obvious, particularly to people who have a good understanding of policing. No doubt pretty much everyone in this room. But if only for the public interest, I thought there might be some value in just sort of reflecting from a larger scope, the broader lens, more or less similar to how we started this presentation. So I bracketed things into 3 distinct groups that I thought were somewhat different from each other and worth considering. So the first section, reports, recommendations, legislation, case law, you could perhaps subtitle this area as non-negotiable external drivers. As we all know, reports come along every so often. Justice Yakibuchi, Justice Epstein, reports produce a series of recommendations, and it's quite often, if not invariable, that recommendations will be directed at training. Of course, we also hear from inquests, we hear from various audits. These also oftentimes contain training implications that we try to respond to as best as we can. In fact, you might say that there's essentially a steady stream on a conveyor belt of different types of recommendations that oftentimes impact on training and create training needs. As we all know, legislation, of course, changes from time to time, and case law is developed. This has training implications. I mean, some examples perhaps could be the decriminalization of cannabis. Case laws like Regina versus Feeney or Regina versus Stinchcombe essentially change the way that we need to do policing, and of course there must be training to compensate for that or to address that. I didn't include it here, but perhaps we could consider that changes to board policy or changes to service procedure also imply training. And I would be remiss not to mention technology, which of course changes with some frequency. Things like body-worn cameras, things like the mobile connected officer, things like evidence.com, or even the latest generation of Taser, the Taser 7. All of these things require a certain application of training to be considered and delivered. This second group, you could perhaps subtitle as the voice of the public. These are the different community groups. We're very thankful at the college to maintain very open, candid, respectful relationships with a number of different community groups. To mention some, I would say the Mental Health and Addictions Advisory Panel, ARAP, the Anti-Racism Advisory Panel, PACER, Police and Community Engagement Review. We talk with these groups, we meet with these groups, and quite frankly, it's of such importance to us to hear the perspectives of people in the community, people with lived experience. As an example, earlier this year, we had members from ARAP and PACER attend at our college on a Saturday, essentially spent the better part of a day demonstrating, giving them presentations, explaining the contents of ISTP, the different components and how they worked. We had a tour of the college. We certainly had some very candid conversation, and not all of it favorable. I would add that there is constructive criticism. There's times when community groups like PACER and ARAP might express dissatisfaction with what we're doing. A couple examples that I can think of, really, were right off the bat. The name of our module, ABR, did not exactly sit well. Anti-black racism was something that members of the community indicated could be better, that perhaps it did not speak or convey the right tone of how the Toronto Police Service was approaching this type of training, that it might give the impression that it was a box-checking exercise or that it was perfunctory in nature. And so we responded to this type of feedback, and you'll hear more about that course from NASA shortly. As well, there was another type of feedback that we acted upon that I'd like to mention, and that is our targets, which quite frankly I confess caught me off guard, because I hadn't expected that there might be some issue with the kinds of targets that the Toronto Police Service uses. For as long as I can remember, about 36 years that I've been around, we've used a dark gray silhouette target for all of our training needs. So members of PACER indicated that this, again, did not necessarily sit well, that perhaps there might be some other alternative. It never occurred to me in this many decades that there might be some different type of perception thinking about these targets other than the way I had. And so we did explore different alternatives, certainly with the approval and direction of Chief Designate Demke. We identified a type of green target to replace the one that we've been using for so long, and the Toronto Police Service has now moved in this direction and will be using this new type of target from here on in. And lastly, this third batch of drivers of training change, I would subtitle this Thinking for Ourselves. We certainly try to keep ourselves informed about the leading edge of training, the policing industry, what may live at the cutting edge. We send our instructors to participate in different types of training far and wide. We bring back that information. We analyze local information as well. We certainly have a use of force analyst at the Toronto Police College. He sees all of the use of force reports, all of the CW reports. Our armament officer regularly reviews use of force incidents. We have a researcher, as Pat mentioned, that we've just recently taken on, who will help us to better collect data, better analyze data. And the point is that the police service does not rest in trying to determine what kind of training needs will be needed today and into the future. So on the subject of changing training, here is Pat again to introduce a bit of explanation about some of the changes that we're having now.
So training at the Toronto Police College, it's a constantly evolving process from design and development to delivery to evaluation. We're constantly pivoting to meet the changing needs of the service, our members, and the needs of our communities that we serve. And it's informed by many different sources, as was mentioned by Superintendent Pareto. We were fortunate to have a number of groups, panels, and committees that assist us with our training development. That includes PACER, ARAP, the Black Consultative Committee, the Aboriginal Consultative Committee, MHAP, and there are others as well. These groups participate in meetings, academic surveys, and in other ways, for example, mentioned when they attended the college, volunteered a great part of their day to help for us to present an in-depth demonstration of the 3-day in-service training program and to receive additional input, feedback, and so we can make ongoing revisions to the program throughout the year. I explained the evaluation component of the training, but equally important is the steps that we take in instructional design to ensure that the training that we create is the highest quality training in the first place, and that it meets the needs of our learners and is using the best practices in the field of adult learning principles. All college instructors complete an in-house effective teaching for adult learners course, and they have to complete an intensive teaching effectiveness certification course through Humber College. We've also made some significant additions to the college recently, including last year the onboarding of an equity, inclusion, and human rights curriculum lead, an e-learning specialist, and 3 civilian subject matter experts that design and deliver in the classroom our human rights material on a number of courses, including day 1 of in-service training. The 2 courses listed above, Black Experiences, moving from reflection to action, and the Indigenous Experiences, both will be integral components of our yearly in-service training moving forward, in line with the 81 recommendations. And at this point, I'd like to introduce Nazra Abdi, who will provide a brief overview of these 2 evolving courses at the top. Nazra is one of our civilian instructors that works in the Learning Development and Standards section. Nazra.
Hello, good morning all. So as Staff Sergeant Coyne mentioned, let's get into it. All right, so this will be a very high-level summary of some of the things that are covered in day one, particularly with a focus on Black experiences as well as Indigenous experiences. So I'll just get started. So to begin, the goal of Black experiences, moving from reflection to action, is simply that. We want to move beyond, talking about what Black experiences are, talking about systemic racism, but actually have learners engage in a meaningful way through looking at what is developing and further developing a culture of respect, equity, inclusion when interacting with the very diverse Black communities of Toronto. Members are required to engage in scenarios, in case studies, as well as self-reflective tools, all embedded in EIHR, sort of the realm of EIHR. And so the objective is to have members not only recognize but consistently disrupt internal and external factors that implement or that impact racial bias. And so what is that? What is that in decision making? What is that in perspectives? And how do you understand that socialization component that we've all been socialized to understand things a certain way, and how are your decisions being made on that? And even to disrupt things like colorblind ideologies, which challenge conversations moving forward. So those are many of the core elements and core aspects that we ensure that we're really diving into, as well as, as mentioned, understanding the impact of systemic racism. Sometimes for some of the members or the learners, it can feel overwhelming to understand where is their role in understanding systemic racism? Where is their role in addressing it? And so that's one of the areas that we ensure that we're making it practical. What can you do today? How do you apply trauma-informed approach? And what are the things that have actually caused trauma, right, within Black communities particularly? So we talk about things like, certainly adding on a layer of scaffolding. We use a scaffolding approach, which is basically layering on an e-learning mandatory course that was delivered to all police officers as well as members of TPS at the end of 2021. And so as part of the community consultative process that was mentioned earlier, our community partners, we've discussed and presented to them. And so the community partners, again, just to reiterate, are CAPFT, so PACER, ARAP, some of the things and areas of concern that we ensured that, there were iterations of the training from the beginning of the year till now. It's looked quite different in that we ensured that, we began by changing the title of the presentation. We also provided better examples of disproportionate impact when it comes to policing in Black communities, as well as expanding on the correlation of historical policies as well as current differential outcomes. So we talk about 208s as a signifier of, trauma for Black communities. 208s for the public is also essentially carding. We talk about school to prison pipeline and what that interaction looks like, because we know that there aren't one or two factors that impact systemic racism. It's a multitude of components. And so that's sort of the gist of the Black Experience module. This was also certainly in support of the ISTP Day 1, as mentioned earlier, delivered and developed through civilian subject matter experts and instructors. Now, the Indigenous Experience course, created by my colleague Christopher Taylor, it takes learners through a journey of Canada's history, told from the original people of the land. And so from that perspective, it's done through storytelling and experiential learning with the members. And it's essentially to enhance their awareness of cultural protocols, roles and responsibilities within traditional Indigenous societies, as well as understanding the significance of the bundle and how important it is to Indigenous communities. We also talk about, through group work and reflective exercises, right? Looking inwards before being able to look outwards is a critical component of learning and training. We also talk about the fact that the Indigenous module seeks to positively enhance interactions with Toronto police officers as well as Indigenous community members. Again, similarly, this course was developed in iteration of the e-learning module Indigenous Experience that was delivered to all TPS members at the end of 2022. Thank you so much.
So this third segment of this phase is essentially an opportunity for me to close the loop on a prior board meeting, the board meeting of July 27th. It was at that meeting that MHAP, the Mental Health and Addictions Advisory Panel, tabled a report that contained within it certain observations that they had made about training, observations/recommendations, and made a request to the chief that he review possible areas of improvement in training relative to those areas that they listed and reviewed within the report. So on behalf of the chief, I thought we could take a look at some of the ways we could address the points raised. The first, transfer of knowledge. And again, there was some acknowledgement that hey, your training might be excellent, but how do you know that it's being applied into the field? Could there be better leveraging of body-worn camera, for instance, or surveys or focus groups and things like that? And the answer to that is, of course, yes. We, as a service, are moving into a policy where all reportable use of force will have body-worn camera footage that's associated to it reviewed by a supervisor. I mean, we already reviewed all CEW deployments as well for body-worn camera. And this essentially means more eyeballs looking at the kinds of interactions that are happening with members of the public and more opportunities for us to see that proper de-escalation, proper training techniques are being used in the field. We're also considering some different types of surveys as suggested by members of MHAP, where we could create focus groups to sort of reach out to members in the field and attend or ask about the different kinds of training that might be playing or proving to be valuable for them. The focus on de-escalation, this really was an observation that they were satisfied that it is very much a priority of what we do at the college. But it made an observation that just the notional use of the word use of force perhaps problematic, and that the provincial use of force model might be potentially renamed to something like the provincial de-escalation use of force model. So this is something slightly outside of our scope, although we do have influence in conversations about these changes. And I would note that the provincial government is at this very time reviewing the use of force report itself, as well as redesigning or considering changes to the use of force model, certainly with an emphasis on de-escalation as one of the driving forces. Intersectionality and implicit bias. Well, this is certainly very much a component of day one, as taught by members of our Learning Development and Standards section. So there was acknowledgement that it exists. Can we potentially provide more emphasis on this? We don't disagree. We think that it's going to very much be a central component of the teaching going into 2023. Intersectionality is discussed in the classroom. There's exercises that officers participate in, and certainly implicit bias is something that we attend to in the scenarios that we play out in days 2 and 3. We look for officers to demonstrate an awareness of these concepts, and not only their own implicit bias potentially, but rather the implicit bias of others. So something we call bias by proxy, or third-party implicit bias. We have video scenarios planned for next year where, of course, officers must be guarded against essentially being the tools of someone else's bias. We've all seen evidence of this in the media, of course. A person being dealt with by police for no other reason than being at the wrong place at the wrong time, in the sense that someone was not happy that they were there, and certainly reacting to it based on their own individual biases. So police officers must be guarded against this. And lastly, community resources and referrals. MHAP pointed out that it would be very important for officers to be up to date and have awareness of all the different kinds of programs, initiatives, resources that exist in that exist in the city. And to this point directly, we are lucky to have an officer, Sergeant August Bonono, who has joined our team at the college, coming to us from the Community Policing and Engagement Unit, and he is something of a subject matter expert. He helped develop the MCIT program. He is up to the minute with all of the different kinds of programs and initiatives that exist across the city, and he is putting together a course for 2023's ISTP that is about an hour and a half long. It talks about mental health, it talks about de-escalation, and it certainly includes all of the different kinds of programs, initiatives, referrals that officers should be aware of and should be making use of whenever appropriate. And so to talk about a couple more items, Pat is going to take us into the 5-day, this is a new course, the 5-day fair and unbiased policing course.
Finally, as far as in relation to evolving courses, it is important, I think, to highlight this one course as it represents a significant development in the way that we train new members that are joining the service. Later this year, the college is going to roll out an entirely new 5-day, week-long course titled Fair and Unbiased Policing. The course is going to cover various training related to equity, inclusion, and human rights. It's going to be foundational training for all new members of the service, whether they're uniform civilian members and regardless of what role that they're going into. It's being designed and will be delivered in alignment with the 81 recommendations, specifically recommendation number 53. And it's also based on recommendations and insights from diverse community consultation groups and stakeholders that I'd mentioned earlier. Components of this training is also going to be included in next year's in-service training course to reach existing members. And there's a biannual refresher course that's going to follow in the future. Thank you very much for having me.
So to close out our presentation, I would like to talk about what really amounts to a fairly significant breaking of new ground in terms of training for the Toronto Police Service. And this is a type of training, we call it peer intervention or active bystandership training. And it's a field of training that has essentially been gaining momentum in North America, particularly in the United States. And it has to do with officers, members intervening when appropriate in specific circumstances. But to better understand active bystandership training, it's helpful to sort of trace it back to its roots. And the roots could be attributed to an individual by the name of Dr. Irving Staub. So his story actually begins when he was 6 years old and became a survivor of the Holocaust in Hungary. So he and his family escaped persecution, probably death, with the assistance of an active bystander who exposed herself to great risk to essentially rescue them from their fate. Dr. Staub emigrated to the United States, became an academic, received his doctorate at Stanford University, was a professor at Harvard University, and you could say that he is the father of training when it comes to active bystandership or peer intervention. His life's work has been to understand what it is that compels a person to do good, what it is that makes a person do bad, and why, in some cases, people intervene to protect people from being victimized as active bystanders, where they do something, sometimes at great personal risk, and at other times people do nothing and are passive. So his involvement with policing dates back to the 1990s. If you'll recall the Los Angeles riots following in the aftermath of the Rodney King viral video, if you will, one of the perhaps first examples of a viral video that seriously that caused deterioration between the relations between the police and community. Certainly that was a conspicuous example of the absence of peer intervention, because while there was an excess of force being used, there was certainly a number of officers who did nothing at the time, and this led to some great difficulty for that service and that city. So Dr. Staub helped develop a program with Los Angeles Police, with agencies within California, to address peer intervention in better ways that they could incorporate this into their training. If we move forward, of course, to about 10 or 12 years ago, New Orleans Police Department was similarly challenged with a deterioration between their relationships with the community. Allegations of corruption, allegations that members of the public were being mistreated, and once again, Dr. Irving Staub, with associates, helped to develop a program for the New Orleans Police Department called EPIC. EPIC stands for Ethical Policing is Courageous. And this program was successful to a certain degree. It was particularly aimed at targeting times when officers could assist each other. And this is one of the approaches that was taken from a cultural standpoint, that officers should think that being active in intervening was something that you did as a favor to your fellow officer. You helped protect their career. And I think one of the taglines that they used was that EPIC was a bulletproof vest for your career. Fast forwarding again to the tragic circumstances of Minneapolis, the murder of George Floyd, we have Georgetown Law University adopting EPIC and essentially converting it into a national program made available to police services. And so this is a 10-step training program that has spread to many agencies in the United States, to a small degree, to some in Canada, and it's called ABLE, which is Active Bystandership in Law Enforcement. There are other programs as well. There's something called TAB, which is Training Active Bystandership as well. So as I said, it's designed to help members properly intervene. And one of the ways it does that is by understanding some of the inhibitors that act on people that might prevent them, or that they might have to overcome in order to take some action. So what we're talking about are things like diffusion of responsibility, the bystander effect, fear of reprisals, fear of being ostracized, fear of being embarrassed. These are powerful inhibitors that essentially exist in the human population. If we were to conduct an experiment with an actor and go out onto College Street, have them clutch their chest and collapse, there would be a number of people who would run over immediately to assist them. There would be other people who would look away and pretend not to notice, and there might even be some people who would turn the corner and walk in a different direction. These are powerful forces that act on human beings. As well, respect for authority or a deference to seniority. Certainly this exists in the public mind. The experiments of Robert Milgram in the 60s no doubt illustrated quite clearly the kinds of things that authority can do to compel a person to act contrary to their values. Respect for authority or deference to authority certainly exists within the police department. As you'll know, seniority matters, rank matters, authority matters, and there's a world of difference between two constables when one of them is a brand new recruit and the other has decades of experience. So this is a powerful force acting on police officers. As well, and not perhaps unique to police, but certainly very present with policing, is the kind of bond that forms between members of this organization. And Dr. Staub himself describes this in the sense that members of an organization who are routinely confronted with things that are dangerous, you think the military, think firefighters, think police, they form very tight, cohesive bonds between one another. There's a type of sacrosanct loyalty to another. We've got each other's backs, so to speak. You are true to one another and know that you can count on each other. And it's in this kind of a culture that it's very difficult to turn away or to somehow criticize a fellow officer. And so this is one of the cultural underpinnings that needs to be addressed. Because when we deliver this training, when we roll it out, it cannot be seen as us trying to undermine that bond between officers. In fact, we wouldn't want to. The way to understand this type of training is to let officers know, members of the service know, that this is a favor that you do for each other. This is a service, a benefit to one another, to intervene when something is not going right, when there is a mistake or some type of misconduct happening, that you are protecting a fellow officer from what amounts to trouble. And certainly the happy byproduct of a correct intervention is police legitimacy, public satisfaction. Certainly some member of the public doesn't experience something that perhaps could be avoided. So strategies and techniques to help reduce officer mistakes. Well, of course, the first thing is to understand the inhibitions in the first place. Understanding what forces may be acting on you is perhaps the first step to realizing what you need to do to overcome them. And then there are different kinds of interventions, and times when it's appropriate to intervene and perhaps times when it is not. So you could say there's mild, moderate, and severe types of intervention. So, and the wrong type can have very disastrous consequences. Not everyone knows, but during the death of George Floyd, there actually was peer intervention that was attempted. The tragic murder of George Floyd involved junior officers who were in the vicinity, actually right there at the arrest, who indicated or who expressed to Derek Chauvin that he should let up, that they should get some paramedics, they should get George Floyd up. So this was a type of mild intervention attempt that was unsuccessful because Derek Chauvin essentially ignored them or brushed them away. That kind of mistake ended up having very significant repercussions that we're all quite aware of. So where will this start out? It's going to start out initially in the 5-day fair and unbiased policing program that Pat was just speaking about. It'll be included there. All new members of the service will get active bystandership training, and certainly when it comes to recruits, who will be the first up to get this, in fact, they've already begun to get some of the trial efforts at this kind of training, will include live action scenarios. We want to make sure that what is taught in the classroom is practiced before recruits graduate, certainly to see that it is taking some effect and that they're understanding the principles. And it's critically important, the issue of live action scenarios. And Dr. Staub himself explains this, if I could quote from one of his talks. What we're talking about is something that requires a type of courage, a type of moral courage, so to speak. And like training anyone to do something that's difficult or frightening that requires courage, you don't throw them in at the deep end. He uses the example of a military paratrooper, that the first time a paratrooper would exercise their training and jump out of a plane wouldn't be out of an actual plane. It would be out of something like a 3-story tower, pretending to be a train. And in that same logic, when our officers potentially have to intervene in some way or another in this fashion, the first time they should do it should not be on a street in the city of Toronto. It should be on a pretend street at the Toronto Police College. As well, I've noted here scenarios will also target pro-social value orientation. And I will confess that I did not know of the existence of this term until about 6 months ago. So a pro-social value orientation has to do with empathy. It has to do with caring for your fellow person, your fellow human being. But it goes beyond that. A pro-social value orientation indicates a person who feels a sense of duty or responsibility to attend to the needs of others, to attend to the welfare of others. And ideally, we're hiring recruits that already come imbued with this value set. But what we know from the research and the literature is that to further develop it, to aid in its growth in an individual, what that person must feel is that doing good makes a difference, that there is some positive outcome that results, that it's not for nothing, that a person might expose himself to the risk of embarrassment, the risk of ostracization, that it has a positive outcome. And so when we conduct our scenarios for active bystandership, we're going to do it a little bit differently. Unlike some of the typical ones where we end at a technical point, when a situation has been resolved and officers have perhaps placed handcuffs on someone or de-escalated something or referred a member of the public to some service, we're going to let the scenarios play out a little bit further than we normally would. When we stop a scenario, we call raisin. That's kind of like a safe word that lets everybody know that the scenario is ended. So we're not going to call raisin until two things have happened. One is that the member of the public, or the person pretending to be the member of the public, for whom the intervention has benefited, will approach the officer and say, you know what, I want to thank you for what you did just now. That made a big difference for me. I feared that things were not going to end up very well. And the fact that you spoke up or did something, and even though that might have been difficult for you, it made a big difference to me, and it's something that I won't forget. And quite frankly, that's nothing that's far-fetched. I think we could understand that most members of the public having experience with the police probably will never forget it for the rest of their lives. But that's not all. We also want the officers for whom the intervention was directed to also approach the student, the participant, and say something along the lines of, depending on the kind of scenario that it is, things were getting a little hand there, I want to thank you for what you did. Maybe I was losing my temper, maybe I was losing my composure, and maybe I even gave you a hard time when you tried to intervene. But now that I've had a moment to calm down and reflect, I want to thank you for what you did. I know it wasn't easy, and it made a difference for me because you helped me not run into some sort of trouble. So those are the ways that we're developing this training. As I said, it's essentially rolling out as we speak, and one of our plans is, of course, is to roll this out service-wide. So this type of training will be incorporated into the 2023 ISTP program. All police officers, sergeants, staff sergeants will get this training. Quite frankly, I'd like to pitch the idea that we distribute this training to senior officers as well so that we're all on the same page and understanding the kinds of cultural changes that we're trying to shift. And that brings us to the end. I'd like to thank you very much for the opportunity to speak today, and certainly would be more than happy to tackle any questions or comments as you have.
Thank you very much for the presentation. It was very comprehensive. We're going to hear from the deputants first, and then we'll come back for questions, okay?
Yes, sir.
Okay, the first deputant on this matter is Farron Malek. Here? Farron Malek? No? No? Okay, Miguel? Miguel, you're the next deputant.
I would like to thank the presenter for the last slide. Active Steinbinder is a great initiative if we want to have police reform in the city of Toronto. You were close to mention something that I know and you guys know is the Team Blue Line. I wonder how are you going to make rid of that police culture? So today I'm here to speak on the Indigenous experience that is on the report, on the training report. So it's no secret, this year I'm running for Ward 13, Toronto Centre, to fill an empty seat at the ward. But most importantly, a seat at this board. We don't have Indigenous voice and representation here at the Toronto Police Services. You know, time and time again, the city appointments had told me, Miguel, we don't have room for Indigenous people. So sad. So what I'm going to change that. That's the reason I'm running. So it's not enough just to have a chief Aboriginal consultative committee. You need that indigenous person here at this board table. Remember, nothing about us without us. So my deputation is with regards to the wonderful training that you guys received at the Toronto Police College. One of those interesting columns, slide, talk about the disabilities. And this is something that is important as part of the training. Last week, we were shocked by the news of a black man who was having a seizure experience. So I can see that you can see his picture right here. The city of Hamilton, when we're approached by the media, they said the police were doing what the training book said so. So the problem that I have is that you guys are trained by the Ontario Police College in Almayer, Ontario. So I don't want to hear that explanation one day when a parent comes to you and said, my kid is dead because you tasered when he was having an epileptic seizure. You see this young man, his whole face is all swollen by the blows and the tasers. We don't want to have this happening in this city of Toronto. So I would like to recommend that as part of the training on the issue of energy weapon deployment, you please take this under consideration when you're dealing with people of the public that have mental illnesses that perhaps they haven't disclosed to you. So please be extremely careful as how to approach people with epileptic seizures. Let the specialists, and that is a topic of discussion to come in February when we come back to talk about the budget. Because we have a pilot project in the city of Toronto, but unfortunately that project does not have funding to continue. So if we're talking also reform, we need to talk about the funding or divesting this Toronto Police Services 1.2 billion so that pilot projects that deal with people in crisis and mental health are fundamentally funded so they can continue the good work they're doing. So in a message for John Tory as a complete my deputation is, don't forget, if you get reelected, deal with the roots of gun violence, the lack of housing, living in extreme poverty. It should be a priority for you as you look for the third term as city mayor. So, in conclusion, this is my deputation for this important training matter that is to be discussed, hopefully, by members of the public. As you see, many times we don't have a deep conversations in this matter. Perhaps we go behind doors, but this is, the public is watching you right now. So we need to have this conversation as raw as they sound. We gotta find solutions because people are dying. Thank you.
Thank you, Miguel. Any questions for Miguel? Seeing none, thank you for your deputation. Derek?
So since this is about training, I just want to remind everyone something I take every chance I get to mention at this board, that how Sergeant Eustace at 53 Division once admitted to me that it would be fraud for a police officer to go around charging people with laws that don't actually apply to them. So it'd be nice to think that that's actually new officers are being trained on that. One thing in regards to legislation, I just thought about this as when I woke up this morning, is whether or not a police officer has seen Section 9.2 of Regulation 181 of the Corporations Act, which basically says that a corporation shall have its name spelled out in all capital letters. Now, as an example of that, my father recently received something from the City of Toronto, Municipal Licensing and Standards, and it's he is addressed his name is all in capital letters. Nobody's grade school teacher taught them to spell their names in all capital letters. I did it in grade 3 at St. Aidan's, and my teacher told me that she'd fail me on the next English grammar test if I did it again. So I don't know if this is just a form of incompetence or they formed the intent to try and defraud my father. I mean, last month I read the case law on what the function of a bylaw and who exactly a bylaw applies to. But, I mean, you know, it's a police board, so I will make sure every month to update everybody on how that's going so Meritori knows firsthand. You know, I often bring up the famous Barbara Frum library consultation, and David Saknacki was there, and he noticed that I really had I had a second question I really want to ask of Mark Saunders. So at the end, he said, hey, Mark, this young man here wants to, and of course, Mark Saunders already knew who I was. And so I asked him based on a conversation I had with former OPP Commissioner Chris Lewis on Twitter, who's since blocked me. I said, do 99.9% of Toronto police officers know the difference between the man, the life and being, versus the person, the legal entity? That this name here, that, you know, the Crown Corp created that name through the birth certificate, the all capital letter name. And I'll never, to his credit, I'll never forget, I mean, he did it begrudgingly, but Mark Saunders did not lie to me. And he said, no, 99.9% of officers, my officers, don't know that. So that's something that should be made part of the training. And Mary Ann Wright probably might remember this, but while we're waiting for Langenfeld, that's candidate for Mayor Chris Langenfeld, versus the Toronto Police Services Board to get going, there was an item before that in which Justice Copeland said to this lawyer who was seeking a summary judgment, she's like, you know, I'm inclined to give you what you're seeking, but you don't have much law here, do you? You're just relying on in your arguments really just based on statute. I'll tell you what, if you come back in 30 days with, like, say, 3 pieces of case law, I'll give you what you're seeking. And I remember sitting there going, wow, like Justice Copeland just implied that she doesn't think that acts and statutes are the law. I mean, they're a part of the law, but they're not the law. And what she said was case law is the law. And I bring this up because, do you remember 3 years ago when, well, not me, but the person I have was arrested at the Northern District Library? The Toronto Police showed up 3 days in a row and dragged me out of that place. And one of the days, I was speaking to one of the officers, and he got around to saying, oh, you know, based on what I was saying, he's like, you're one of those free men on the land, sovereign citizens. I said, well, it's interesting you say that because there's, I mean, it's a reference regarding the secession of Quebec. There's a Supreme Court case that acknowledges that people are sovereign. And he just looked at me and he shook his head, and I'm like, what do you mean? He's like, no. I'm like, what do you mean, no? He's like, oh, that's not the law. And I was just like gobsmacked. I said, you're serious? I just told you that's from the Supreme Court case, and you're telling me Supreme Court cases aren't the law. So, I mean, he ended up being all right with me in the end, but like ever from that moment, that kind of really shook me, that the idea that there are Toronto police officers out there that don't think what the Supreme Court has to say in one of their decisions is the law is a grave matter of concern for the public, and which has probably led to such a breakdown in trust that the people have towards the Toronto police. So it's my time.
Thanks, Derek. Any questions of Derek? Seeing none, thank you for your deputation. We'd also like to thank Nicole Corrado for her written deputation. I will now go to questions of service members. Board members, any questions on the presentation? Councillor Grimes first.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Superintendent, I think you said 6 months to go through the college, is that correct?
To complete the basic constable training program, yes, 6 months. Start
Is that
to
the
finish.
same for a special constable?
13 weeks.
13 weeks. So I think the maximum you can take through is 120 at one time, correct?
It's a factor of the space that they have at the
Yeah.
Ontario Police College. And of course, it's a factor of how many people we can actually form up into a class. And normally we try to go in increments of 30 because that is the classroom size at the college. So 60, 90, 120 tend to work out better for us.
So what's the process now? So to get the right person, we think there'd be an officer, he or she, to get to that 100 or 120 that's going to go enter the college? What's the process leading up to that?
So I sort of alluded to that in my earlier presentation, that that's a presentation all unto itself. So there's a unit within the service called talent acquisition, and it's very robustly staffed, and they have their work cut out for them, quite frankly, because they're trying to get the best and brightest, the most qualified members for the service. And it's quite a laborious process. I mean, it starts with the application, of course, and then it goes from there. And there's a number of stages along the way. I don't want to not do it justice, quite frankly, and Superintendent Ishmael Musa would be the person who could probably give you a presentation of some fulsomeness that would walk you through it. But applications, background checks, criminal record checks, references, all sorts of things go into establishing that the person is the right fit for us. There's psychological profiles that are established. And ultimately, it could take months and months. They arrive at a panel that gives the final yay or nay, if you will. And then they're formed up into the classes. They're given formal job offers, contracts, and then the process begins of making them into police officers.
So let's just take, for round numbers, 100 are going through the college. How many don't make it through? Like, is there, out of 100, like on a percentage-wise? I don't know if you can answer that.
It does happen. I mean, so despite the great efforts of talent acquisition from time to time, we do have people that do not make it, perhaps for academic reasons. Perhaps it has happened that there's been elements of misconduct that have been seen. I mean, we hire from the human population, and we're an imperfect species, as we know, and so sometimes it doesn't work out. But I think I can say with some confidence that it usually does. We usually get it right. And even though someone perhaps may not be perfect, and no one is, we try to help get them to the finish line in the most appropriate way. But certainly, there's a standard to be met, and we don't shy away from that standard. If
someone's not that perfect to get right through, would we maybe recommend to be a special constable or move them somewhere else?
Sometimes there's a possibility that a person may be an ideal candidate in all respects, but that maybe being a constable is a little too much, perhaps at that time or perhaps always. And so there's different job opportunities within the service. You may not make the best police officer, but you might still make a great employee of the Toronto Police Service.
And I guess this is to the chief. What's our full complement now? Chief, if everybody, the perfect world for you, everyone's working, what's our full complement?
Actually, Stefina, what is our precise complement currently?
We're currently around 4,950 police officers and 2,370 civilians.
Out of the 4,950, how many are actually coming to work every day or every shift out of the 4,950? How many do we have on the street or in?
Well, there's a standard sort of rate in terms of sick, leave of absences, vacation. So you have to usually take 20 to 30% off of that.
So 20 to 30% off the 4,950 are actively working now. Great, thank you. Those are my questions, Mr. Chairman.
Mayor Tory. Thank you, Chair. And can I say thank you, first of all, for what was, I think, an excellent presentation, both what we received in writing, and I include the report in that, the report that deals with effectiveness. I think of all the things we do here, having an oversight on this and having knowledge on it is very important. I'd just like to ask a couple of fairly quick questions. Well, I say quicker because they're more granular, and then get to the one that I guess is of greatest concern to me in terms of this overall exercise. First of all, I wanted to know whether the 5-day course that's talked about that you're implementing soon for new recruits, then you mentioned that in-service officers will be getting the course. Will they get the 5-day course? I would doubt that, I guess, in the context of our ability to have them. But I just didn't know you didn't cover that.
So no, the aspects of the 5-day course are going to be distributed throughout all the members, quite frankly, but this 5-day course is going to be for all new, not just police officers, but all new members of the service, particularly the recruits as well. I don't know if I've captured that correctly, Pat, but...
In addition, there's also the 2-year refresher that will be for all...
You want to come to the microphone?
In addition to the 5-day, which is for onboarding all new members, moving forward, the biannual, every 2-year refresher course will incorporate existing members for that same material, so we are able to capture everybody along the way.
That's sort of what I'm getting at. They don't get 5 days, and again, I realize some practical implications but in a way, I sort of just proceeding from the assumption that the people who need it as much, let's put it that way. When I say need it, that it will benefit from it as much as people bring existing. Police service, I know that sort of turns over from time to time as new people come in and other people retire. There's a mass of people, pick a number, 4,000 or 5,000 that are kind of there for years at a time. And so I'm just trying to make sure that we're not, within the bounds of practicality, we're not, because of practical reasons, making sure that the existing members of the service, as opposed to the new ones, get the full benefit of this training, which I think is extremely important in the context of our city, just given its nature.
So yes, Mr. Mayor, I suppose within the bounds of practicality, to get all of the frontline officers through this 5-day course, we couldn't do it right at this moment. But the idea is to, whether it's through every 2-year refreshers or ISTP, which is really our main vehicle to get at frontline officers. We see them regularly every 12 months, and it's the components of the 5-day unbiased policing course really that matter more than the course itself, because we take those core ingredients from it and make sure that our frontline officers get it. So I get your point exactly. I think that the people who need it the most should be receiving the training, and while we can't get everybody through for 5 days, I mean, it's hard enough to get them in for 3 days, quite frankly, because there's radio calls that need to be answered. Yeah.
Again, I should rephrase my own use of the words "need it the most." I don't think that's the way I meant it, but I mean we need to be making sure every single member of the service has a full measure of this training, albeit that it probably has to be delivered for existing members just because of the realities of their being in active service. Okay, just a couple things that are again on this sort of granular basis. I was very disappointed to read that when it came to you trying to find people to sort of evaluate this training, that there was no one who bid. Now, is that because people were afraid of the controversy involved with police training, because it's always a discussion of political, or is it because we were offering something that nobody bid on from the standpoint of it wasn't good business for them, which I see happen sometimes in procurements? Like, why did nobody step up? Because I think, the surveys are fine, and I'll come to that too, but, the notion of having somebody external who one assumes is an expert in this look at these things and evaluate them is obviously very helpful to us and to you in looking at that kind of objective examination.
So, Mr. Mayor, you're referring to the perceived low response rate of survey?
No, I'll get to that too. Okay. No, this is about when you put out an RFQ. In the report it says here you put an RFQ and nobody replied.
Yeah, I understand it was looked at 29 times and it produced 0 bids. So whether we revisit that process is something to be discussed, perhaps to be decided upon. Certainly not by the college per se, but by people in this room. Whether we will pursue that anew.
Okay, but because I think even just going and getting from the 29 people or whoever looked at it some feedback about why they didn't bid, because I think this notion of objective. Having somebody objective from outside look at it is good. Now, then you mentioned the surveys, and I'd taken a note of that. And I noted that, first of all, we only surveyed, in some of the references here, and again, I know there's a whole bunch of different things that are listed. We only surveyed, I think, 20% of the people who took part in the course, and then only 25% of them, I believe if I'm right, responded. And it was mentioned in the notes that this might have been a fear, I think that's actually the word that was used, but an apprehension that people had that if they participated and were candid, that somebody might take this out on them or something. I mean, have you looked into that? I know surveys, historically don't get that much response in any place, any time, but this one is so important to us that I just wondered if you'd looked into that.
So the answer is yes. Are we interested in this? Have we looked into this? Yeah, and if we're speaking honestly, I mean, we say that these surveys are conducted anonymously. There are members in the service who say there's no such thing. I'm on a computer that is provided to me by the police service, and true anonymity is not in play. That said, when we look at the sampling that we sent surveys to and the response rates, I mean, while it might seem low, when we did some investigating, we found that there was basically in line with all of the anonymous surveys that the service sends out, that it's usually about 20 to 30%. This is not inconsistent, and even with types of surveys beyond our organization. But the way we will be trying to address this is by doing it differently going forward. So as Pat was explaining, rather than send out the survey for anonymous completion via email, because an officer can forget about it, get busy, or just ignore it, when they come back to us for ISTP, we're going to sit them down. We've got a captive audience, so to speak. And now with technology, we can essentially say, so before we get going, we're going to conduct a survey on the kinds of training that you got last year. So this is within the 6 months to 1 year range where we start to look at, did this affect your behavior? Did this kind of training that you got last year, did it play itself out in a positive way? So we've got them captive. We're going to make them take the survey, and it'll still be anonymous, although there'll always be naysayers or doubters. But before the class proceeds, we'll make sure that the survey is completed. And I think we're going to go from 20% response rate to 100% response rate.
That's good. And that relates to my last question, because I do have the greatest concern about this area of the learning and, did officers learn what they were supposed to be taught, and that would be true of any learning exercise. And hearing you suggest we could use technology appeals to me a lot, because I realize that people, will be suspicious of any other methods. Some people will. Technology allows you to literally have people pick up a handheld unit out of a basket, as it were, to oversimplify it. Nobody will know who picked up what unit, and test things. Because I was wondering whether we talked as well about testing, not just from the standpoint of saying, did you think this training was effective? I mean, I took note of the fact that I think 40% on the anti-black racism, for example, had a neutral to negative rating on it, which is pretty high. And again, I'm not being critical of that. I mean, I'm glad we asked, and I'm glad we got an answer, because it suggests we've got more work to do, obviously, and we know that. But I was wondering whether you could actually also use that technology to anonymously, and it's critical in this area, be anonymous, that you ask questions to see if people's attitudes, or if that's the right word, their perspectives on these things. Because look, I know how much I've learned from taking the anti-black racism training at City Hall and here. It changed my way of looking at things, just sometimes small things that become big. And so I didn't know whether you had any thought about, because this is just surveying that says to people, did you think it was effective? And those answers are worthwhile looking at, but there's also the other kinds of things you can survey that sort of try to probe at people's, mindset, if I could put it that way, and see if overall it's having the desired impact. I think that's the crucial part, not what people thought about whether it impacted them, but whether it actually did. It's tough. It's a tough area, I know.
Of course, Mr. Mayor, your point is very well taken, and I mean, I'm no expert on surveying, and I don't know if Nasser or Pat want to jump in and perhaps say that as we go forward, we're going to think more carefully about this, deliberate better and get better kinds of information back to us about attitudes, as you say, quite frankly, because that's one of the key ingredients to effecting change in this area. So, I don't know, Nasser, would you be able to comment on how we put the surveys together and how we might better measure, as instructors, attitudes of the officers?
Yeah, you can imagine that that's something quite challenging in the space of the time that we have. However, there are some immediate reactions that we do assess. So for anti-black racism, or now the Black Experience course, we do have immediately, so once the session is done, we have learners fill out a number of questions, i.e. things that they've learned, questions that they may still have, areas that they sort of struggled with, and then that information actually informs areas that we can improve. So are there things that we're seeing, are we seeing a pattern, are we seeing a theme that the last 300 officers noted that were areas of challenge for them to sort of grasp, let's say a certain concept. So then we can, the benefit of ISTP is that we can make changes, they may be small, we can make changes as we go along. And then for the development of 2023, we can continue to use that content as a way to inform and better utilize the officers in, getting to some of that deeper conversation. There are sometimes questions that, they may not have a platform or a space to ask. And I think that that's the benefit of having civilian subject matter experts, because it does break down some of those challenges, where personally I can speak from my own experience. I've had many officers come to me after class, and we've spent, 20 minutes talking about things that they may not have had someone else to maybe disrupt some of those thoughts or challenge some of those thought patterns when it comes to decision making, or when it comes to areas of reference, right? So who is your point of reference? What is your point of reference? When you're an officer, you are in a certain, you're seeing things a certain way, and there's a lot of trauma from the officer perspective, and that's why we have the resiliency and wellness module at the beginning of the day, to be able to sort of shift some of those thoughts. So I hope that answered the question.
It's helpful. Thank you very much. And my questions are not meant to be as critical as they are just probing how we can do even more, because I think what you're doing and all this whole presentation, the fact it's here, is incredibly important. And so thank you very much.
Thank you.
Mr. Morgan?
Thank you very much for your presentation. So I have a couple of questions, one more sort of general and then a little bit more specific. I think a lot of what I'm hearing speaks to police culture and the different types of trainings that are being offered. I'm just wondering if there is something that speaks specific to that, isolating that piece in terms of part of the training around culture, because I think when you spoke about the issues around the active bystander. That speaks to culture. And so how in the training, what is being provided for those that do come forward? How are they being supported to be able to provide that? And I think, one of the deputants sort of mentioned the whole sort of culture that speaks to that protecting of one another and supporting one another, recognizing that, in crisis situation that I have your back, you have my back. So, but if somebody steps forward in that sort of heightened emotional state, what is being provided in terms of support for them?
If I could just jump in before the superintendent does, part of what that speaks to is much bigger than training, obviously, and so we have a respectful workplace program. It comes on the heels of the Deloitte report that was presented at the beginning of the summer, as well as some work with Bernardi Law, and the follow-on of that work is really a cross-sector working group with other police services, where this is very much recognized as a challenge that we're all collectively trying to address. And so over and above some of the training components, it's around the tone that's set, around leadership, around the promo process, around things like exit interviews. And so there's a whole suite of other recommendations that have been made that we're working on implementing. We're in various states of that I think aim at addressing some of the pieces outside of training as well.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. I don't know that I could add much more to that other than full agreement and acknowledgement that the college is one part of the overarching efforts of the service. And certainly what we do matters, but culture is quite a large animal, as you can imagine, and it doesn't turn on a dime. So we work at it, there's earnest effort, and certainly we acknowledge that there's a lot to do. But we continue.
Yeah, no, I recognize I'm myself in that sort of institutional space and understand the challenges around that. So therefore, the question I'm asking and making sure that part of that is the understanding that there's a dedicated understanding of shifting that and being very active and progressive in looking at what are we doing specifically, not just with new recruits coming in, but these existing members, how are we shifting those pieces? So I'm thankful that, to hear that obviously this is part of the going forward and the expectation. And the second part to my sort of more specific question, and I know this is not necessarily speaks to this type of training, but I was wondering more specific to when you're looking at those units that are interfacing with the public in a more sort of heightened emotional state, whether it's guns and gangs or it's the public orders unit. What specific training is offered for those folks when it comes to either the selection process, recruiting? Just maybe talk a little bit about that if you can, and sort of the evaluation of
Sure.
those members.
Sure. So it's kind of a broad-reaching question, if you will, because there's certainly training that corresponds to all officers, and all officers would include members of those specialized units, public order unit, guns and gangs, etc. But there's a host of courses specific to them as well. So for instance, I'm a member of public order, and I know that we conduct regular training, and a lot of it has to do with aspects of de-escalation and keeping your cool and being respectful and protecting people's right to protest, but protecting the dignity associated to that. So, I mean, your question can be taken so broad, and I might have to walk you through all of the different types of units that interface with the public, as you say, in some of those more heightened states of mind. The ETF, a drug takedown, a high-risk vehicle stop. There is intense and comprehensive training associated to all of those kinds of activities, right? We appreciate that some of these types of encounters are higher risk, and therefore there's more extensive training provided to those units. Do we always get it perfect or right? Of course not. But certainly there's plenty of examples where things maybe did not go quite exactly right, and we try to learn from those experiences. So there's a lot of training at the college that essentially reflects things or times when things did not go that well. And it doesn't necessarily because we've been compelled to address that issue from some external agency, but rather because we think for ourselves, as I mentioned earlier. We see that we self-evaluate and see that, we can address this through training, or maybe through some other means. I mean, sometimes it's an issue of discipline, quite frankly. There's misconduct by mistakes, and then there's willful misconduct. And so you have to sort of take the situation as it comes and identify the best way that it might be tackled. But certainly, training is associated to all of the things you mentioned. All of those types of encounters, in some way or another, are impacted by the quality of the training, and that it's not only living in the moment, but anticipating the kinds of training needs that will arise going forward, because the world is continuously changing. So this is where we need to keep abreast of where the future challenges lie. I don't know if I got a little bit rambling there, so I apologize.
No, absolutely. I guess in sort of some sort of my view, when it comes to where the potential challenges may come from in terms of being that active bystander, it would potentially come from those spaces where the emotions and safety concerns are more heightened, and looking at how to best support someone that does come forward in that sort of situation. And I guess that's what I'm trying to really, if you're looking at the sort of starting point or a place that might have greater opportunity for that conflict or that challenging decision making by a colleague, it might be within those spaces. So, and just how that's being addressed. Yeah.
No, I take your point, and quite frankly, you've expanded on what I was trying to say earlier about the cohesion, right? The strong bond that forms between general members of the police service. But the point you make about specialized units is that it is that much stronger there. So it's one thing to be one of 1,000. It's another thing to be one of 10, and you work with those same 10 officers day in and day out. You form strong friendships, you form extremely strong bonds, and you do form what could be an inhibiting way of thinking when it comes to challenging each other. But hopefully the training is such that it makes officers aware that it is not an act of disloyalty, it is not a betrayal to help a fellow officer away from trouble, away from jeopardy. Now, of course, there's all sorts of factors, proper supervision, vigilance, right, as those kinds of units go about their business. And are the right kind of people in those units in the first place. So sometimes this may even go upstream to the selection process, right? Psychological tests, for instance, they weren't always being used until one day they were, right? Because we had to determine, for instance, for the emergency task force, there's a psychological evaluation that determines a person's attributes or whether they would make a good fit with units that are routinely exposed to kind of high-risk events and that sort of thing. So I take your point. I hope I've sort of answered it. Training is a part of it, but there's a lot of other factors that have also come into play to make sure that officers who do come forward are supported and they feel comfortable and they understand that the culture will not eat them alive when they do the right thing, that the culture is shifting in a way that we want it to.
Right. Thank you.
Vice Chair Nunziata, and then Ms. Kostakis.
Yes, thank you, and thank you for your presentation. So I just have the one question. Would TBS now be affiliated with the ABLE as it rolls out this new training?
So, we did take a very careful consideration of the ABLE program. It has some very fixed constraints and standards, and this isn't to say that it's not of great value, but like any decision of this type, there's pros and cons to creating the certified partnership that ABLE more or less offers to police agencies. So there's a few small services in Canada that have availed themselves of this kind of partnership or training. Other large ones, for instance, the OPP looked at this as well and decided to introduce their own program. Certainly this is the direction that we have been given. We're grateful for the Chief's confidence in our ability to introduce this training ourselves. Certainly we'll continue to evaluate it as we go and refine it, improve it as best as possible. So is ABLE a possibility in the future? Of course, any type of training can change over time, and we'll make sure that we are using it in the most effective way and that it's accomplishing what we want it to.
Chair, if I could just jump in for a second. We had some conversation with the OPP who looked at it in depth as well. There was just some constraints. It was very Americanized. We just felt organizationally here and with our partners, we could develop something that would be state-of-the-art right here within our province, and so that's our intention at this point in time. And if I can just, if I may, before the next question, I just wanted to point out a couple of things, is that when we talk about the standardized training for all our members, it's the most important, because contrary to what people might think, the most violent and confrontational system in events are the frontline uniform officers of the vast majority of our special squads including ETF, quite often deal with planned events where they have time, talk, tactics, and a whole bunch of people around. It's that one or two officers going to the scene that are often confronted with the most dramatic events that have to deal with. That's why the training is across the board. The second comment I'll make is that despite all the, or in addition to all the training that goes on at the college, individual units do their own training. And so many divisions as well will bring in local community training that affects their community. So for instance, 13, 53, and 32, we have the Gesher program, which is bridging, and the Orthodox Jewish community comes in and teaches our officers to understand that culture. While there's no electronic devices, despite an emergency on a Friday to Saturday night, from sundown to sundown, it's that kind of specialized training. Our specialized units do the same type of training that is very pertinent to them as well. And so that is in addition to what goes on at the college. Quite frankly, though, we're having some difficulty at the unit levels now with the new 4-platoon system. We don't have quite the amount of overlap time that we had under previous shift system, so it's a little bit more problematic trying to fit that in. Quite often it might be a Sunday morning, but there's additional training as well as to what goes on at the college.
Thanks, Chief. Councilor Nunziata, have anything further? Ms. Kosakis?
Thank you. So just pretty much piggybacking on everyone else, what everyone's saying about reactive, it's almost like reactive training and responsive training. That's probably, sorry, nobody usually has a problem with hearing me. There we go. So the duration of the training, and it is intentional training, which is I think what we're coming from as well and what the chief spoke to on the specialized training. Do you find one, and I'll ask that first, do you feel that with your evaluations and just monitoring the complexity of everything, the recommendations that we're all abiding by as well, et cetera, is that the training, is it long enough? Or do you have plans maybe in the future to extend training?
So just to clarify, are you talking about a specific type of training or sort of training in general?
Training in general, when they start from the process, when an officer is to be, once they pass to come into Elmer, et cetera, and moving forward, that 6-month period, and then 13 weeks, et cetera, do you find that that's sufficient and long enough right now with everything that's just so complex with the changes that were coming through as well?
So, I mean, thinking from the perspective of a college, perhaps there's a certain bias there. Would we like to have more time? Could we make good use of that time? Of course. And if you look at different kinds of police institutions around the world, you'll find that it ranges widely. We're a little bit more than the average in the United States in terms of sort of the basic core training, and there's parts of the world where it's about a 2-year process, quite frankly, that involves academic credentialization as well. So we're at 6 months, no doubt, through an iterative process over the years. Is it enough? Well, that's in the eye of the observer, I suppose, quite frankly, but I think we should probably make it clear that when they graduate and are given their badge by the chief, they're not done learning, right? This is just the beginning of a lifelong process of learning. You saw about this 46,000 types of training. I mean, divide that by 8,000. I mean, there's training that each member is going to be receiving of different types all throughout the rest of their career. So would we like another month or two at the front end? Could we produce a better product, if you will, if that's what you're asking, because we're a type of factory that makes police officers? Would we benefit from some more time? Of course, but that's more time not on the road, and that's more cost. There's cascading effects. I mean, the college becomes quite a busy place when we have 120 recruits there, and that imposes itself on the other kinds of training that we try to do. So to stretch it out would mean that something else would have to give, right? So there's always it's always a balance. You put something in, you have to. What are you going to put out? There's only so many hours in the day, so many instructors available. And that sort of thing. So hopefully that sort of answered your question. Would we like more time for training? Yes. Is it within the bounds of practicality? Well, we try to push up against the bounds of practicality as best we can. But whether we have it perfect or not is perhaps not for me to say.
Yeah, no, and it wasn't the perfect piece of it. It was more the content because it's so complex and the training, and obviously you have to get into the field too, coming from social work background. I mean, we had practicum in between the courses, et cetera, and theory over 4 or 5 years period. And this is just as important, just as serious, and the training piece, especially with the complexity of what we're trying to change within the culture as well and adjust. Mm-hmm. So it was more that way than the dream, and it was also about in your evaluations, in your observations. It's not about just wanting more time. Is it necessary to have more time in order to deal with all the content and the complexity of the content of the training process and pieces of it?
So So I guess to your point, I mean, as we go about evaluating our officers, we feel that we reach a satisfactory threshold, right? If with more time, with more energy, with more resources, could we set the bar a little higher and do a little bit better? Of course. But I certainly don't want to create the impression that there is not enough of something and therefore there is an inferior type of training or police officer that emerges from the college. We're quite satisfied. We're quite proud of our officers, quite frankly. We think the training is excellent. And we think that the officers that come through our college do excellent work day in and day out.
Great, thank you. And then just partially, I was happy to hear that you're looking at training also for the supervisors above, who actually, I think it should be consistent that they have the same knowledge, if not more, and also identifying when maybe an officer, like a frontline officer, may be in need of either further training or is in a place where they can also contribute into the training pieces. And I think to touch on what Mr. Morgan was saying too, that culture and the fear, which I've heard repetitively too, in people coming forward during training and not being snitches or not being, well, this isn't working for us, and having that, I guess, courage in one way and lack of fear to come to you. Are there any intentional sort of conversations or courses or training or just encouragement to change that culture within right from the get-go in moving forward, or any intention to do so?
Well, I'd be hard-pressed to point to a very specific item that deals in a focused way with that, but I'd like to think that those kinds of concepts are interwoven into all of the training courses. I mean, right from the get-go, as I said, the culture begins on day one with recruits. And so they'll understand about different reporting mechanisms. They'll certainly understand from a policing standpoint what's right and what's wrong. And for instance, they'll understand that failure to speak up in certain cases is itself a type of misconduct. So will this be interwoven into where this might be more focused on is during the active bystandership peer intervention training, because it calls into conversation some of those kinds of scenarios that you're talking about, the comfort level to do something, and to not have it be viewed by the cultural elements of the job as being disloyal or somehow stepping outside of the fold. And I think we can do this, quite frankly. I mean, officers understand the impacts when something has gone wrong. It's not only to them, to their career, but to their families. I mean, these are long-lasting effects when unfortunate events unfold. So that if we can sort of see speaking up, stepping in, there's different terms for this kind of thing, as a way that you're helping one another, I mean, that in itself, I think, can be perceived as a type of loyalty. In the moment, perhaps, it might be difficult, but if we do good work in this area, I think that it will take hold. And quite frankly, it's a type of training or a type of thinking about policing that is gaining momentum across North America, certainly. With smartphones, viral videos, and everything, we know the scrutiny that we're under, and we want to help each other provide the best product. So, again, I'm sorry, I'm sort of rambling off in a couple other directions, but
you're good.
I hope that it sort of addressed what your concern was.
And then just lastly, I promise, you have different trainers. Obviously, the content is the same, but the delivery, as we all know, is always going to be delivered differently, and people learn differently. But the trainers also do that. Do you have any feedback, or do you provide opportunities for feedback on the training, I guess, styles of the various trainers? Because receiving and how I'm going to come out of it as well trained will also depend on who's training me and how they're training me, even though the content may be the same.
Of course. So we have different cooks in the kitchen, but they're all following the same recipe, so to speak. So we'd like to think that there is a satisfactory level of consistency, but we hire human beings to do our training. Some will have their own unique styles. I think that's up to the job of managers, quite frankly, and supervisors to sort of see that deviations in style or deviations in to a small degree with content don't in any way compromise the learning objectives, right? So. I guess if I understand your question correctly, do we keep track of the styles of teaching that we're employing and the ways our different staff go about their business? Of course we do, and it's an acknowledged. I think we just acknowledge that there's going to be subtle differences, but that at the end of the day the product must be consistent. Because when we start the training at the beginning of the year and get to the end, there has to be a certain consistency. Things have to conform to the course training standard. When we look back on what the Toronto Police Service provided as training to its members in, say, 2021, there can't be wild variations. We can't oscillate between one kind of training and another for the same course. We have to be able to say with some confidence that this is how and what we trained our officers in.
Does the class, and so the last part of that was, do the class who has been trained, are they given the opportunity to give an evaluation or feedback on the trainers?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
Thank you.
Chief?
Yes, just one final comment, Chair, as we wrap this up. I just want to comment that, we have some of the most intensive, comprehensive training before anyone becomes a police officer and they get their badge on graduation today. And in the Canadian context, we are way ahead of other countries in terms of what we do for training. And quite frankly, I'm quite proud of what's being accomplished. And you can see the passion involved here by the superintendent in terms of what we're doing at the college. And I think active bystandership and what we're doing with that going forward is an example of just the kind of work and the quality of the work that's being undertaken.
Great, thanks, Chief. Any further questions? I just have one real quick one. In terms of community feedback, did you want to add anything to your comments that you've already given us? I think you mentioned that you've spoken with MHAP, ARAP, PACER. Anything you wanted to add in terms of community feedback, which of course is really important to all of us?
Well, I suppose what I would add and emphasize is that we value these relationships, these opportunities to get community feedback. The voice of the public, I think, is how I termed it. And as much as they have come to see us this year, we would like to have them back to see us, quite frankly. We would ideally have them come to us in the fall, if possible. I mean, there's always scheduling arrangements and all that. But as 2023 content takes shape, the sooner the better, quite frankly, because at the front end is where we can sort of really ensure that we try to reflect what the community concerns are. So we'll, as we go forward from today, we're going to be reaching out to representatives of these of those three community groups and invite them, quite frankly, request them and be grateful for them considering coming to see us again and looking at the program we're developing for next year.
Thank you very much. Members, speakers, anyone wish to speak to this item? Seeing none, I just want to thank you for your presentation. I don't think you could have done better. It was terrific.
Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. And Chief, thank you for your comments as well.
Sorry, Chair, if I may, I thought there was going to be somebody who would speak for me. I was just trying to put together a small motion here because I do think it's important that on some of these matters we've discussed that are, challenging, such as, I was just starting to write it, getting an expert third party and to just report back to us at Q1 of next year, how we can improve the take-up on the surveys, how we can, and I just wanted to sort of put these down because I just think that it's important that we sort of list them and that there be some kind of a time when this group might come back and just supplement today's very excellent report with, how they've sort of given further thought to some of those matters. So if you could maybe put it over just before you.
Why don't we hold down this item? Right, we'll hold down this item now. We'll come back to it after the next item.
That'd be great. Thank you.
Is that okay? Great. Okay, item number 3 we're going to move on to now, which is the Auditor General draft project implementation strategy. And we have a presentation followed by deputations, followed by questions of board members. Sorry, I need to pause this item. I just found out that item number 8, we have some community members here to do deputations and they have to leave. So with your indulgence, we're going to move to item number 8 first. And item number 8 is the annual report 2022 filing of Toronto Police Service procedures. We have 3 deputants. The first one is Miguel. Miguel, when you're ready.
Thank you. Thank you again for the opportunity to address this board. At its meeting on August 18, 2020, the board approved 81 recommendations for police reform that were contained in a report by Chair Jim Hart entitled Police Reforms in Toronto, Systemic Racism, Alternative Community Safety and Crisis Response Models, and Building New Confidence in Public Safety. In response to recommendation 36 of the service, create a formal procedure review process and made accessible to the public website 41 service procedures and appendices of public interest that govern the interaction of police with the public. I'm a resident of Ward 13, and I'm very proud that our city is very diverse, and we have so many places of worship, synagogues, Buddhist temples, masjids, all kinds of churches in the world. Last week, is a picture. The Sanctuary, which is a homeless church in the Ward 13, was raided, and there was no proper search warrant delivered to the church. When asked where is the search warrant, there was no reply. I'm bringing this matter to your attention, and I sent already a confidential email to everybody here at this board, including Mayor John Tory, because many of these policies that we make are the directions of policy to be applied by our Toronto police officers. So on page in page 4, it says, obtaining a search warrant, yes, there is a board policy with regards to search warrants. My question to you all, do your officers care to provide a search warrant notice as guided by TPS board policy? In the case of the Sanctuary Church, that was not the case. On page 3, Appendix D, handling items of religious significance. Surprise, surprise, there is no board policy. And here's where this board needs to do some changes as see fits. Churches are a place of refuge. By law enforcement disregarded across Canada. Many times they have violated this holy space by rogue police officers to arrest someone who are looking for. As you may hear, the police union, the lawyers, and these services, and the Solicitor General will agree that all the officers were doing their job, following procedures and policies directed by this board and Mayor John Tory. One of these police procedures to be filed, item identification of criminals, there is a board policy with regards to the use of force and arrest. During the raid, it's seen on video because we had the right to record the police. It seems that a police officer is removing his arm of service, scaring the hell out of the people that are living in this church that it has been converted into a homeless shelter. So you have terrorized these people for life. With branding guns in public, it's scary enough. These people they're not looking for more police officers or more policemen. They're looking for permanent housing, good jobs. So it is very disturbing to hear that this pastor who is here in this picture got arrested by simply recording the police interaction. That is not acceptable. I won't release the name because we want to we're respectful of the investigation processes. So, but in my email to you, I have revealed the name of this officer, and I hope your training officers who were here this morning, giving us eloquently how are they planning to move forward with changes such as being an active bystander and moving on, et cetera, et cetera. So please respect places of worship. And this is not a way to address when they're looking for a search warrant of someone who has escaped bail or something like that. Thank you.
Thank you, Miguel. Mayor Tory, do you have a question?
I just had a question, Miguel. I hadn't seen your email because I guess I just asked, and I guess it came very early this morning.
Can you speak louder? I can't hear you.
Sorry. I hadn't seen your email because I guess it just came early this morning. But could you help, because I try to stay on top of what's going on in the city, but where did this happen? What is the church you're talking about, and when did it happen?
Okay.
I'm not aware of
This
it, so-
event was shared in social media. It happened last week, Thursday around 1:30 p.m.
And where was that? Where was it?
It's called the Sanctuary.
Oh, okay, I know this. I just didn't know where it was. Okay.
Yeah,
thank
it's here in the Ward 13.
Thank you.
Any further questions of Miguel? Thanks for your deputation. Appreciate it. Dr. Sharma? Welcome.
I acknowledge we are situated on Indigenous lands. Thank you for this opportunity to be here today. I'd like to acknowledge my fellow Hindu community members sitting in the audience, some who have had to leave because of the delay in my presentation. My name is Dr. Ragini Sharma, and I'm here as president of COHI, Canadian Organization for Hindu Heritage Education. In my professional work as child welfare worker and community worker with TCHC, I have worked closely with Toronto police officers and know firsthand that TPS is a leader in policing. Today I'm here to speak on four matters: attack on Hindus, attack on our temples, attacks on our religious symbol, the swastika, and liaison with our community. Hindus are deeply alarmed and concerned about the growing number of criminal attacks on them. This is not the Canada we know and love. Several Hindu students of Indian origin have been beaten, some have been killed. Hindus have been harassed for public display of their faith and have been threatened and physically assaulted for celebrating. Unfortunately, this seems to be a global trend. In Canada, there seems to be blatant prejudice against Hindus when crimes of similar nature experienced by other communities are called hate-motivated, yet the same is not reported as a hate crime when the target is a Hindu. It is critical that this issue is addressed by the Ontario Human Rights Commission and the police. Over the past year, GTA temples have seen a severe escalation in crimes. There were 15 criminal incidents reported. As a community, Hindus feel violated and traumatized because our temples is our home, where we felt safe until now. The September 14, 2022 attack on the iconic BPS temple in Toronto was the last straw. Our petition seeking action from politicians and police against such hate crimes gathered unprecedented 35,000 signatures in 4 weeks. Disturbing graffiti was painted on the gates of this beautiful temple, which the Prime Minister, Mayor Tory, and many other distinguished people have visited. The graffiti read, "Death to Hindus," in large letters, Stan in small letters, which means the place that Hindus live. The Hindu community was deeply hurt and angered when the police called this incident an act of violence. We are aware of the fact that minor incidents that happen in other places of worship are quickly termed as acts of crime motivated by hate. We fail to understand why Hindu places of worship are not given the same respect. Calling such crimes an act of vandalism sends out a message that crimes against Hindu temples will not be taken seriously. This seems unfair, and we ask that the TPS investigate this incident and all other attacks on Hindu temples in the same unbiased manner. Hindus need to be reassured that they have the right to equal protection under the law as any other community. We also request police protection for Hindus in their just efforts to reclaim the swastika, which is an auspicious Sanskrit word that means well-being, also honored in the Indigenous community. There have been several attempts to ban and criminalize the sacred ancient Hindu symbol as seen in the federal C-229 bill, still pending. The swastika has no connection to the similar appearing Nazi hate symbol known as Hakenkreuz or hooked cross. Hitler never used that term swastika for his hate symbol. Jewish community leaders across the world agree that Nazi hate symbol is not the same as the Hindu swastika. We are requesting police to allow us to publicly display our sacred swastika without fear of persecution and prosecution. We would like to discuss how this can be done for our upcoming Hindu Heritage Month in November. Last but not least, it's a matter of disappointment that police liaison with the Hindu community is being done under the South and West Asian grouping. This seems inaccurate, as Hindus come from all over the world and our identity is of religion, not geography. A request to form a Hindu advisory committee has already been made to the police chief and is pending. However, consideration has been delayed. We strongly urge you to form a Hindu advisory committee to address our concerns as a religious group, similar to the one that exists for other groups.
Thank you, Dr. Sharma.
We consider this matter of equity and inclusion. Thank you for this time.
Thank you very much, Dr. Sharma. Before I see if board members have any questions of you, Chief, I just wondered if you want to comment. There was quite a lot said there. Did you want to comment on any of what the deputant said?
Well, first of all, what I would say is that there may be some issues of underreporting as well, because we have not seen in the last 3 years an uptick in violence in the Hindu community. And in fact, so far this year, we had only 4 instances of anti-Indian hate crime occurrences in the city. Certainly across the GTA, there's been some incidents as well, but even Peel and York aren't reporting an increase. Nothing that's been out of the ordinary. We certainly know that on the basis of world events and the issue of Sikhs wanting an independent state apart from a united India, that certainly seems to be an impetus for some of perhaps what we're seeing across the city. We do have, and the BAPS incident is one that the doctor has referred to. It has been, we have characterized it as an anti-Indian hate crime at this point in time as we try to investigate it, so, and to determine who was responsible for that offense.
Thanks, Chief.
And the other thing I will say is that our hate crime unit and Detective Bisla has been working with the doctor and then some of our folks, and is very much interested in collaborating with the community to see what we can do to help improve this situation.
Thank you. Board members, any questions? Mayor Tory?
Thank you, Doctor, for the presentation today. I should say that this was brought to my attention in a more explicit way, the issue of anti-Hindu hate crime in the last several months, first at a roundtable before the BAPS incident happened, and I'd undertaken at that time to put together, as I had done with anti-Asian hate and with Islamophobia and anti-Semitism, a group that could help advise me as to the steps that we could take, because they're all different depending on the nature of the hate. I just wanted to ask you, though, have you, for example, had, or I say you, has anybody from the faith, which I realize is broadly dispersed across the city, had any specific discussions about the security issue with the Toronto Police Service? Has somebody reached out on behalf of the faith as a whole and all of the different mandirs to discuss the issue of security? Because I know the service has been more than willing, within the bounds of practicality, to provide that kind of security where requested to other faiths where they had either short-term or longer-term reasons to be nervous, and I just didn't know if there had been, to your knowledge, any specific discussions that had not been responded to on the issue of security.
Mayor Tory, I think there is a group called Rakalika. There's a representative here from Amit, and they have been pursuing this. And I think there's 3 members on the South and West Asian group. I think it's a very watered down approach to addressing our issues. As you're aware, Mayor, the BAPS temple, people are very reserved. They don't want to be out and they've been invited to come, but they probably prefer to work quietly and do their work of spreading peace. The presence of the temple itself is a blessing on the city. So, I think there are people who are, there's Mr. Rao here from Hindu Forum Canada. And Mayor, I wanted to point out my husband Vinod Sharma. He's here from the cricket group, so I hope you recognize me too from that. There is a lot of concern. We traditionally, as a community, have been more into forgiveness and moving on, but we realize that there is an increase and that we need to come forward. As a community, we are more interested in going to work, pay the taxes, and pay the bills, and to move forward. We don't like to be in the face, but I think we've reached a point where we feel that we need to come here and speak with you and ask you that we need not a Southwest Asian group, we need a Hindu advisory group, and we're willing to follow up with this. Many people have been calling you. I think there's been meetings with mayors from across the GTA, and I feel that Toronto Police is a leader. And I think that you could show leadership in addressing the Hindu temples, because the Hindus that live in Toronto go to these temples across GTA. So although it seems like a cross-jurisdictional point, it is affecting the Hindus that live in Toronto, because we do travel to the GTA for our temple visits. So maybe on a coordination level that needs to be addressed.
Yes, and I think you'll find it's going to be, if I can, just Mr. Chair, before, just to ask a request more so than a question, which is that, we're going to take some steps to establish at the city level, and we usually have the police very much involved in these discussions with different groups, as I've mentioned, to try and fashion a program that is suitable for that faith group or whatever group is experiencing hate and discrimination. But it really will help the police do their job and help us to sort of understand the breadth of this, which I understand better now, having sat at this round table, and people then went around the table and gave me instances that had happened mostly in more recent times.
Yes.
But if people could be encouraged to report these things, because I think it does help a lot to understand where and when it's happening, and that it is happening on a much broader basis than I had understood, and that I think a lot of people had understood. And your deputation today is very helpful in that regard, so I just want to thank you.
Thank you very much. And I hope we can do something about the swastika, because it's been, there's a small town, Puslich, I think near Guelph, that there was a street called Swastika Street, and unfortunately the name of the street has been changed to Holly Street. So there is this continuous effort to call the swastika a hate symbol, and for us, the community members, seems like an urgent matter, and we'd love to have a ceremony at City Hall and have the swastika displayed there. And as an educational tool, I take the role of education. I think that's the only way to address. Police is there to enforce, but I think if you could facilitate an educational process to inform the community and spread some goodwill towards the swastika as a sacred symbol for 2 billion Hindus, Jains, and Buddhists across the world. Thank you so much for this opportunity. Namaste.
Thank you very much. Derek?
In this report, one procedure mentioned is 05-23 financial crime investigations, fraud, and false pretense investigations. So I'm here to speak a bit on how banks are now just stealing money from out of our accounts and calling it a service charge. And not only that, they're now taking away our bank books, which we used to use to keep them honest. And how many times have you gone to the bank, deposit something, got your bank book updated, checked it. Oh, hold on a second. What's this? Oh, sorry, my mistake. Let me reverse that. Right? So they're taking that away, and now they're sending you monthly statements, and ironically, stealing another money out of your account and calling it a service charge. So this is from Canadian Pioneer Management versus Labor Relations Board of Saskatchewan in 1979, where the Supreme Court of Canada said that banks create credit. It is a mistake to suppose that bank credit is created to any important extent by the payment of money into the banks. The bank does not lend money. Citadel General Assurance versus Lloyds Bank Canada in 1997, the Supreme Court of Canada said The respondents took the position accepted by the authorities that a bank deposit is simply a loan to the bank. So all of your money that you have deposited at the bank, you're actually the lender and the bank is the borrower. And the borrower is slowly stealing your money. And how did you get that money? By having to go to work. So a bank's ability to create credit, when you really think about it, is based on your labor, which they are slowly stealing from you. Saskatchewan Cooperative Credit Society versus Canada Minister of Finance, 1990. This is from the federal court. The common law dictates that what is intended is a loan that is repayable on demand. The relationship between banker and customer is that of debtor and creditor. So the banker is the debtor and your deposit as a creditor, they call you a customer, but that really makes you the creditor. Cusack versus Day, 1925, Court of Appeal for British Columbia. But the book does not embody the terms of the contract between the depositor and the bank. The only entries to be found in it are figures or sums of money written in full in a column for that purpose to prevent fraud. That's why, if you didn't realize it before, you realize it now. The purpose of that bank book was to prevent fraud. Now, if they're taking those bank books away from you, it's a lot easier for them to defraud you. Wouldn't that make sense? There are a couple sections in the Bank Act of Canada, Section 440 and Section 447. Section 440 says, a bank shall not directly or indirectly charge or receive any sum for the keeping of an account unless the charge is made by express agreement between the bank and a customer or by order of a court. Section 457, a bank shall not directly or indirectly charge or receive any sum for the provision of any prescribed products or services unless the charge is made by express agreement between it and a customer or by order of a court. There was a documentary a while ago I watched where this guy interviewed the late, when he was federal finance minister, Jim Flaherty, and he simply asked him, what would happen if we all went down to the bank and took out all of our deposits? And Jim Flaherty was like, we would like instantly have a severe credit crisis. Because people don't realize, I don't know if Councillor Grimes and Councillor Nunziata remember this, but like 12 years ago, City Council invited down to Toronto City Hall a 12-year-old girl named Victoria Grant who explained how banks create credit. And they don't exactly create it out of thin air, but they create it based on your deposit. So if you deposit $1 with the bank, last time I checked, the Ontario Superintendent of Financial Institutions won't even answer my question now. Based on fractional reserve lending, that $1 you deposit with the bank, they were, last time I checked, able to create $32 worth of credit that they lend out to someone that they get 8% return on. Where did they get that money to create the credit? Based on your deposit, that deposit, which is a loan, which they are now slowly stealing money from you in the form of service fees.
Thanks, Derek. Any questions? Seeing none, thank you for your deputation. Also like to thank Nicole Corrado for her written submission as well on this item. Board members, any questions of staff on item number 8? Anyone wish to speak to it? Can I have a motion to receive item number 8? Ms. Kostakis, second by Councillor Grimes. All in favor? Any opposed? That carries. We'll now move back to, are we ready to go on number 3 or should we go back to 4? We're ready? Okay, we'll go back to number, ready, Meritori? Sorry, one more minute. We're just going back to item number 3. We'll get to you eventually, I promise.
If we could just display the motion, Mr. Chair. Is that, we're moving back to deal with the motion that I was going to put?
Yeah, we're going back, back to.
Yeah.
Going back to item number 2, I said 3. I misspoke.
So I don't need to speak to it except just to say what its component parts are. Just, is it up there? Okay.
Sorry, Mr. Chair, we're just getting the motion put up on the screen. Just 30 seconds, please.
My purpose in moving it, and I can just deal with the component parts quickly when it goes up, is
Sure.
just to make sure that on some of these things we discussed, which I think are, helpful to make the learning part even more effective and to sort of track down a couple of the issues involved in things like getting better response on surveys, knowing how challenging that is, so that, that's a different motion.
Sorry, motion for item 2. Diana would have just sent it to you.
And it would ask for a report back in Q2 of next year, which gives a little while for them to digest some of these things. And just so we can sort of be kept up to date about whether they found any answers to what I know are perplexing questions. I can just read it off the, because it's not really that complicated, off your...
Just read.
Well, I wrote it and then it was put into... here we go. There we are. So it's the efforts to retain an expert, because I think this is important to have some third-party outside expert to examine the training programs and evaluate them for us. The evaluation survey uptake is obviously low, and it often is a challenge with these kinds of things. To have a more complete understanding of how the fair and unbiased policing course will be offered to existing service members, because that's very practically difficult to do, given that it's a 5-day course given to new members, and how will you do it effectively across the service. And then finally, if there's any way to sort of measure the changes in perspective on the part of members from these courses using technology anonymously and so on, to see if you can determine whether they're effective at really sort of embedding the learning into the service and the members of the service. So those are just things that they could give us a brief update on, I hope, in Q2 of next year.
Councillor Grimes, did you have a question, or do you want to second it? Okay. All in favor? Any opposed? That carries. Item is amended. All in favor? Any opposed? That carries. Thank you very much. Now item number 3.
Morning, Chair.
Who's a project manager at Strategy Management, who will go through a slide presentation. But before we put that up, I just want to give you a high-level sort of overview of what our strategy is. So as everybody will recall, in June 22nd of this year, the Auditor General, Beverly Romeo Baylor, presented the 3 reports containing a series of recommendations aimed at improving the Toronto Police Service's operations related to calls for service and the 911 operations. Members of Strategy Management Pillar have drafted a strategy to guide that implementation around those recommendations. And as everybody's aware, the service has agreed with all of the recommendations, the 51 recommendations that she prescribed. The implementation strategy is centered around the following project goals: fostering a commitment to change in line with the service's recent work implementing other police reform measures, building a process that supports achievement thinking, demonstrating momentum and ensuring the implementation work begins immediately, and increasing collaboration and communication with city partners and other external stakeholders. The implementation team performed an analysis of all 51 recommendations, and all major stakeholders were consulted as part of that process. The recommendations have been classified by projected duration of implementation works. We have short, medium, and long-term goals. And the recommendations have also been categorized according to the 5 themes outlined in the AG's capstone report. Emily will speak to that in her presentation. Existing projects and related work will be integrated into the AG project where possible, and all recommendations have been mapped to existing service projects. Prior to beginning the implementation work, key performance indicators will be developed for each of the identified themes to assist with measuring the project's success. And discussions with City of Toronto implementation team counterparts have already begun, and the service will meet regularly with our counterparts to ensure the work and goals are continuously aligned. There will be a public report at the June 2023 meeting with a fulsome project update. At that point, we will present hopefully our success. And I would just like to mention, I hope that Paul Johnson, the Deputy City Manager, is online here this morning, as well as Kate Bessel, who's the Director of Strategic Policy and Planning with the city, is here to join us as well. I think, are they on, Doobie? Yeah. So I think maybe they'll have the last words. Emily's going to present the slide deck. It's a short presentation, and if we can maybe have Paul and Kate say a few words. Thank you.
Hey, good morning, everyone. Thank you for the opportunity to present to you today. So as Staff Superintendent Johnson mentioned, my name is Emily Much. I'm a member of our Strategy Management Unit. And we recognize that the board is going to be an important stakeholder in getting these recommendations implemented. So we appreciate the opportunity to present our strategy to you this morning. So centering our presentation or our implementation strategy on the following goals is going to be very important. When the presentation happened at the June board meeting, we took on board the idea that in order to actually have long-lasting change, we not only need to just kind of get to work on the recommendations, but we need to build a process that supports achievement thinking. And we also need to get going with the work. It's important for us to get some momentum going, get some change happening in order to make sure that we can reach the goals to implement the recommendations that the AG has put forward. Most importantly, we're going to be collaborating with partners at the city, and that includes agencies such as paramedics and Toronto Fire Services, because this isn't something that we can achieve on our own. So just for ease of kind of reference, we've kind of shortened the two main names of the reports that the AG put out. One of them pertains to calls for service, and one of them pertains to 911 operations. So we've already begun the analysis of all the recommendations identified, and in order to kind of make sure that we get some of this change happening right away, the idea is to begin working on some of those short-term goals, ones that we can actually start getting some change and movement on. If we can get some quick wins going, then that will build momentum and allow us to continue on this path of implementation. So in the capstone report that the AG put together, there were 5 kind of overall themes that seem to go beyond to both the calls for service and the 911 operations reports and recommendations. And so we thought it would be a good idea to ground our strategy in these 5 themes. The first one is alternative response. So further exploring calls for service alternative responses to free up time for priority response unit officers and 911 communications operators and help provide better outcomes for people. In terms of optimizing resources, that's the improving and using our data to enhance staffing and operational strategies and ensure adequate resources are in place to help address the priority areas that have been identified. Timing methodologies, so enhancing our response time methodology overall, but also improving emergency response times and 911 call answer times. In terms of community education and awareness, we want to build greater awareness to help manage the demand on our 911 lines and also some of the expectations that our PRU officer responses primarily for emergencies and for police matters. And finally, and most importantly, collaboration between stakeholders. We recognize that this is going to be a journey of collaboration, not just internally, but with our partners at the city and other stakeholders as well, to build better outcomes by moving forward together. So this final theme is going to be applied to all of the recommendations, not just the ones that we've grouped into the different, the 4 other areas. A cross-organizational collaboration approach is going to be very important to support implementation. We recognize that any change that we make has to be iterative. It's not going to be a situation where we just kind of tick boxes off of a checklist. There's going to be a lot involved in moving from where we are today to where we want to be. It's not a one-time endeavor. So building continuous improvement into some of our programs and processes is going to help support this lasting change. At the end of the day, we want to strive to cement the reputation of our service as an organization that drives progress. So as we go through implementation, it won't just be a matter of considering things marked off and checked as done. We'll be going through and reassessing and reevaluating to make sure that we are addressing, changing priorities in the city as well as changes within our own organization, including leadership changes. The most important thing when we were coming up with this strategy is making sure that we can align with existing projects. As everyone's aware, there's already a lot of efforts underway to change the way we're doing business. So we are going to be leveraging and incorporating existing projects into our plan. So instead of imposing new work onto those projects, it's taking the work that's already being done and integrating it into the work that we want to do. In addition to police reform and race-based data collection, there's important work being done in other areas of the service, including the Information and Technology Command Benefits Framework. And under the Corporate Services Command, there's a lot of projects, but not the least of which is our new approach to service-based budgeting. So the 2023 budget process has already begun, and we'll be making sure that we integrate that project into any plans that we have for AG implementation. So before we begin, it's important to measure how successful or our hope for success in this project. So we have some in-house people within our strategy management unit that are going to be helping to support identifying KPIs to measure progress. But this is also something that we'll be getting some help from our amazing analytics and innovation unit. So we'll be working with them to come up with some KPIs to help measure progress and success. In terms of an implementation structure, we're going to be putting together a steering committee with senior leaders from our organization. They are going to help drive the implementation. So we want to ensure that all the work is aligned across the different pillars. And this group will also be identifying subject matter experts in their specific areas that they want to work with the strategy management project team in order to make sure that we are able to tackle the recommendations correctly. The most important kind of work that the steering committee will be doing is helping us prioritize the order of the recommendations to work on. That way we can get some momentum going and allow some of the changes to be implemented quickly. Those working groups that we've identified will be kind of working across the two different recommendation groups. So they won't just be working on calls for service or 911. A lot of the same subject matter experts will be involved in both of those in the work involved in implementing those recommendations. So we'll be making sure that we structure our working groups along the lines of the different themes that we've been identified. And as well, it's going to be important for us to communicate across with the City of Toronto team. So we're going to be setting up kind of regular meetings and a regular kind of cadence for reporting just so that we can in the same way that we want to make sure that we're understanding all the different work that's being done internally that might impact the implementation of these recommendations, it's important for us to do the same with the team at the city. I know there's a lot of great work being done by the different areas, different departments in the city, so getting it together and communicating so that we can understand that the great work that's being done and make sure that it aligns with the work that we're trying to do. So the goal is to just kind of take those existing projects, identify any gaps that might be existing related to implementing the AG's recommendations, and fill those gaps. So in terms of a roadmap to implementation, work has already begun. The analysis work is close to being complete, and the steering committee has been kind of formed. We'll be meeting shortly. As Staff Superintendent Johnson mentioned, we'll be reporting back to the board at the June 2023 meeting with a full one-year update, to explain kind of how things are going. But after that, I think once we hear kind of some of the feedback from the Auditor General's office and from the board, we'll probably be doing some evaluation and reassessing just to make sure that everything's on track. We recognize this isn't a project that's going to be something we can do in a couple of months, so it'll be important for us to keep everybody up to date and make sure that we're also not just explaining updates, but we're receiving feedback and pivoting accordingly. Great, so thank you.
Thank you very much. Before we go to questions of the service, we have one deputant on this, and then we'll come back to you. Derek?
I just want to say, by me speaking at this meeting, this shall not be deemed to be in any way my consent expressed or implied in doing so as fraud. God bless His Majesty the King, and long live His Majesty the King. And if I've ever led this board to believe that I am a person as mentioned in the definition for deputation in this board's bylaw definition section, then that would be a mistake, and that I ask this board to please forgive me. So in this report, there is a letter from Deputy City Manager Paul Johnson, which mentions the Auditor General identified opportunities to support more effective responses to calls to service through, amongst other things, greater community education and awareness. So I just wanted to make the Auditor General aware of a recent example of government overreach where the Toronto Police came close to getting involved in another frivolous, unnecessary call for service. This is from the Toronto Star. According to Toronto Chief Communications Officer Brad Ross, city security guards confronted the group because the press conference contravened municipal policy on the use of city property during an election. He said the policy is not new. According to his campaign, at one point, they threatened to call the police. Now, in regards to his campaign, they weren't talking about Blake Acton, who recently challenged Mayor Tory to a debate, and in return, he'll donate $5,000 to a choice of whoever Mayor Tory chooses. So as I just want to point out what Justice Jill Copeland would probably point out what the law is on this matter. So this is from City of Toronto versus Ontario Attorney General 2019, the Premier Ford's City Council cut case, where the Ontario Court of Appeal said, electoral campaigning, presenting prospective voters with messages intended to convince them to vote for the candidate, is undeniably expression for the purposes of Section 2B. So what happened here is, here's freedom of expression, and here's the City of Toronto down here. City of Toronto, which does not like freedom of expression, tries to circumvent that by saying it's a policy that you can't do that in Nathan Phillips Square. But you all now know what the Court of Appeal just said about its undeniably freedom of expression. And because like this is the second time this guy's done this. Last summer at the tent encampment clearings where Miguel, Council Ward 13 candidate Miguel Avila was at, he started making stuff up about the permitted media zones. Go on Canley sometime and do a search for permitted media zones. I have, you know what comes up? Nothing. So now, first it's the permitted media zones, now it's this. I mean, I don't know if he just imagines whatever pops into his head becomes reality, or he's just lying about what the law is, but somebody's got to take care of this guy and straighten him out. So I know more than anyone about how the Toronto Police feel about getting called for unnecessary, frivolous calls for service. Again, I just mentioned earlier about the Northern District Library. 3 days in a row, I went in there, and 3 days in a row, they called up and dragged me out. Well, one day, the two officers there were like, yeah, we've been here for 2 hours over this. And this was when they found out that I was banned and in the eyes of the library trespassing, because in the end, ultimately, I mentioned a librarian's name on Twitter. So once the Toronto Police found that out, they weren't too happy about being there 2 hours. And they mentioned, like, we could be out there saving a baby or actually fighting real crime. And I'm saying this because you all found out last month that there's a library area service manager who thinks at the Agincourt Library that talking out loud is allowed, because technically there's nowhere in the legislation that prohibits it. So as Justice Jill Copeland would probably say, let's take a look at what the law says. So this is from the Committee for the Commonwealth of Canada versus Canada, 1991. Supreme Court of Canada said, the following are the reasons delivered by Justice McLaughlin as she was. This case brings before this court for the first time the question of the extent of the charter guarantee of free expression on state-owned property. Chief Justice Lamer suggests a Section 2B test based on the compatibility of the speech with the function of the state-owned property in question. He argues, for example, that the protection of freedom of expression afforded by Section 2B of the Charter would not extend to the Parliamentary Library because silence is essential to its function. Because I just want to save Superintendent Gregory Watts any headache having to waste his manpower sending any officers out there because they get tired, again, of me complaining too much about them not doing anything about people talking too loudly.
Thank you, Derek. Any questions of Derek? Seeing none, thanks for your deputation. Board members will now have questions of service members on the presentation. Vice Chair Nunziata, you're first.
Yes, just a question on the implementation structure. You mentioned when you did your presentation there'll be regular updates, correct?
Sorry, yes.
Yes. So how often would we get the updates, and would the updates be forwarded to the AG as well?
So the updates to the board will be yearly, and to the AG as well.
So it'll be yearly updates?
That's correct.
Oh, okay. Okay, thanks.
Any further questions? Just a quick one. Can you tell us a little bit about your linkage back and forth with the AG throughout this process, how you're going to link with the AG's office? I know there's an annual update. Is there any more linkage beyond that, and with the city as well?
So it's through the city, through Kate and Paul, to make sure that the AG is looped in. We have we had a working group as this thing. It was a year-long process, and as a result, we formed some really good partnerships with the AG's staff. And I know they have reached out to us early on in our planning for the implementation strategy to help us if we need. So I think the door is always open. There's an opportunity for us to engage them if we need to.
It's a quick question on 911. I know one of the huge issues are the number of calls that come into 911 that really shouldn't be coming into 911. Is there a media strategy that's being contemplated? Can you just update us on that and what your thoughts are?
So we are working with the communications staff as well as our comms people as well to deliver an education component to the public. There's internal messaging as well as external messaging that's being worked on right now. I think we have a date for that to go forward, but it is one of the things that we're working on.
Those are all my questions. Board members, any further questions? Anyone wish to speak to this? No, seeing none. Thank you very much for your presentation.
Thank you, Chair.
Really appreciate it. Motion to receive the presentation of the deputations. Vice Chair Nunziata, seconded by Ms. Kostakis. All in favor? Any opposed? That carries. We'll now move on to our last item, which is item number 5, which I held down because we have a motion to put up on the board. But before we put up that motion, any questions on item number 5, board members? Seeing none. Ryan, can you put up the motion and walk us through the motion that you developed yourself?
Sure. Thank you, Mr. Chair. This is a report, as board members will know, from the city solicitor. The inquest into the death of Mr. Wetlaufer and the jury verdict and recommendations has officially now been received and reviewed. And so the recommendation is twofold. Point number 1 is just official receipt by the board of the verdict. And then the second is board direction to the chief to provide a report back at the board's March 2023 meeting that outlines the services perspectives concerning the recommendations that the jury put forward from a feasibility perspective, a usefulness perspective, and an implementation approach perspective. That way, the service will have an opportunity to weigh in on each of the substantive recommendations, identify what is feasible and what the path forward is for implementation, as well as monitor those that are directed at the province.
Thank you, Mr. Teschner. Any questions on the motion? Seeing none, I'll move the motion. Can I have a seconder? Ms. Kostakis? Sorry. All in favor? Any opposed? Item is amended. Vice Chair Nunziata, second by Councillor Grimes. All in favor? Any opposed? That carries. Motion to adjourn. Ms. Kostakis? Vice Chair Nunziata, all in favor? Any opposed? That carries. We stand adjourned. Our next public meeting is on November 14th. Thank you, everyone.